Imagine standing on the edge of one of the bloodiest battlefields in human history, where millions of lives clashed in tanks, trenches, and firestorms, and the very earth seemed to tremble under the weight of war. This is the story of the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle ever fought, where courage, desperation, and unimaginable suffering collided on an epic scale. From the relentless German offensive to the Soviet counterattacks that turned the tide of the Eastern Front, every moment reveals cruelty, heroism, and survival against all odds. If you've been fascinated by human endurance in the face of horrors, don't miss our other chilling stories in the Human Stories of History playlist, where we explore the deadly experiences and suffering in camps, sieges, and battles throughout history. Hit that subscribe button and like this video for more deep dives into the darkest, most compelling events of our past. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing our audience from all corners of the world come together to uncover history's truths. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The Road to Kursk, Germany and the Soviet Union in 1943. In the long and brutal saga of the Second World War, the year 1943 marked a decisive shift, a year when momentum on the Eastern Front began to tilt away from Germany and toward the Soviet Union. The vast battle that would later unfold around Kursk was not merely another clash of armies, but the culmination of years of bloodshed, shifting fortunes, and hard lessons learned by both sides. To understand why Kursk became the stage for one of the greatest armored battles in history, we must retrace the road that led there, examining the circumstances that shaped the choices of Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin in the early months of 1943. The year had opened with the reverberations of disaster for Germany. Just weeks before, in late January, the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad had been encircled, starved, and finally destroyed. The surrender of General Friedrich Paulus and his exhausted forces represented not just a military defeat, but a symbolic collapse of the image of German invincibility. Nearly 300,000 Axis troops were lost in that catastrophe, and for the first time, large numbers of Germans had marched into Soviet captivity rather than the other way around. The myth of Blitzkrieg's unstoppable momentum had been shattered amid the frozen ruins on the banks of the Volga. For the Soviet Union, the victory at Stalingrad was cause for celebration, but it was not yet a guarantee of safety. The Red Army had gained confidence, but it remained battered, its soldiers weary from 2 years of relentless fighting. Stalin and his generals knew that Germany would not collapse immediately after one defeat. The Wehrmacht, even weakened, still controlled enormous swaths of Soviet territory, including much of Ukraine, Belarus, and the approaches to Leningrad. The Germans still held strong positions, and the winter of 1942–43, while favorable to Soviet counteroffensives, had stretched Soviet logistics to their limits. Thus, while Stalingrad was a victory, the broader war remained unresolved, and the front lines were still fluid and deadly. By early 1943, both armies paused to take stock of the situation. Germany's military machine had suffered a terrible wound, but Hitler remained convinced that he could seize the initiative again if he struck decisively. For him, the key lay in regaining the psychological and military advantage lost at Stalingrad. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, recognized that time was beginning to work in its favor. Its factories, relocated east of the Ural Mountains, were now producing tanks, planes, and artillery at an astonishing rate. Its manpower reserves, though strained, could still replenish divisions faster than Germany could. Both sides knew that the summer of 1943 would bring another titanic confrontation, and each began preparing accordingly. The shape of the front itself set the stage for what would follow. After the Soviet offensives in the winter, The German lines bent inward around the city of Kursk, forming what military historians call a salient, a bulge into enemy territory. This salient stretched roughly 250 kilometers north to south and about 160 kilometers east to west at its widest point. Its western face protruded deep into German-held territory, making it a tempting target for an encirclement operation. For the Germans, the salient looked like an opportunity. If they could pinch it off by attacking simultaneously from the north and south, they could trap enormous Soviet forces inside. For the Soviets, however, it was both a danger and an opportunity. They anticipated the German plan and decided to transform the salient into a fortress of defense, ready to bleed the attackers dry. Behind these strategic considerations lay the personal obsessions of the leaders themselves. Hitler, shaken by Stalingrad but unwilling to admit weakness, sought a victory that would restore faith among his generals, his soldiers, and his people. Stalin, conversely, having tasted success, was now more willing to heed the advice of his generals, including men like Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, who urged patience and careful preparation. Both sides sensed that the next clash could shape not only the Eastern Front but the entire course of the war. Thus, in the months following Stalingrad, preparations began on both sides. German industry rushed to complete new heavy tanks, including the formidable Tiger and the much-anticipated Panther, weapons that Hitler believed would tilt the battlefield in his favor. Meanwhile, the Soviets were digging, mining, and fortifying the Kursk region, determined to create defensive lines so deep and deadly that even the most powerful German assault would be ground to pieces. What neither side could fully grasp at that moment was the scale of destruction that awaited them when summer came as the snows of winter began to melt in early 1943. The road to Kursk was already being paved not only with steel and gunpowder, but with the ambitions, fears, and stubborn will of two regimes locked in a struggle for survival. The echoes of Stalingrad had barely faded, yet both Hitler and Stalin understood that a new battle was on the horizon, one that could eclipse all before it in its size and ferocity. Kursk would soon become not just a place on the map, but the crucible where the fate of the Eastern Front would be decided. The months that followed the Soviet victory at Stalingrad were marked by a strange rhythm of advance and counter-advance. In February and March 1943, the Red Army, believing that the Germans were too weakened to resist, launched ambitious offensives across Ukraine. Their aim was to liberate cities like Kharkov and push the enemy further west, but they soon learned that the Wehrmacht, though battered, was far from broken. German Field Marshal Erich von Manstein orchestrated a brilliant counterstroke, later known as the Third Battle of Kharkov. With disciplined maneuver warfare and the skillful use of armored divisions, the Germans retook Kharkov in March, stabilizing their front and demonstrating that they retained formidable striking power. This moment reminded the Soviets that while the tide of war was shifting, the enemy could still deliver punishing blows if underestimated. For Hitler, this counteroffensive was proof that the Wehrmacht was still capable of decisive operations, but it also exposed the limits of Germany's strength. Losses had been severe, and replacements were increasingly difficult to find. Germany's allies, Romania, Hungary, and Italy, had been badly mauled on the Eastern Front and could no longer be relied upon to carry significant weight. The German war effort now rested overwhelmingly on its own divisions. Meanwhile, Allied bombing campaigns in the West were beginning to target German industry, straining production even as Hitler demanded more tanks, more planes, and more ammunition for his Eastern gamble. That it was against this backdrop that the Kursk salient became the focus of planning. The bulge in Soviet lines was obvious on every map, and to German planners, it seemed to offer the possibility of encircling vast Soviet forces with a pincer movement. Hitler was captivated by the idea of restoring the initiative with one powerful, focused strike. His generals, however, were more cautious. Some, like General Heinz Guderian, argued that Germany should avoid large-scale offensives and instead adopt a defensive posture, bleeding the Soviets over time while conserving resources. But Hitler was impatient. He believed that only a spectacular victory could erase the memory of Stalingrad and demonstrate to friend and foe alike that Germany remained a dominant power on the Soviet side. Joseph Stalin and his generals analyzed the situation with growing confidence. Intelligence provided by partisan fighters, reconnaissance, and even information from the British, who had broken parts of the German codes, indicated that a major German offensive against the Kursk salient was inevitable. Rather than rushing headlong into another offensive, Soviet planners decided to prepare a defense unlike anything seen before. They would transform the salient into a killing ground, an elaborate series of defensive belts layered with minefields, trenches, anti-tank positions, and artillery emplacements. Their strategy was simple in concept but formidable in execution. Absorb the German assault, let the enemy exhaust himself against their defenses, and then launch crushing counterattacks to drive the invaders back. The preparations that unfolded in the spring of 1943 were monumental. Soviet engineers and soldiers dug thousands of kilometers of trenches, laid millions of mines, and camouflaged their positions with great skill. Civilians in the region, men and women alike, were mobilized to help construct defenses. The Red Army built not one defensive line, but several, each designed to slow, weaken, and bleed the attackers before they could reach the heart of the salient. Behind these defenses, reserves of tanks and mechanized units waited, ready to strike once the German spearheads lost momentum. At the same time, Soviet industry was achieving remarkable feats. The T-34 medium tank, already a symbol of resilience and effectiveness, rolled off assembly lines in ever greater numbers. Newer versions with improved armor and firepower were entering service, giving Soviet tank crews better odds against the German Tigers and Panthers they knew would soon appear. The sheer volume of Soviet production was staggering. Thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces poured into the Kursk region in preparation for the coming battle. By the summer of 1943, the Red Army was not only stronger than it had been a year earlier, but also far more experienced, hardened by continuous combat, and guided by lessons learned at great cost. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler postponed the offensive several times, waiting for the new Panther tanks and Ferdinand tank destroyers to be ready for combat. Each delay gave the Soviets more time to strengthen their defenses. German commanders grew uneasy, fearing that the element of surprise was being lost, but Hitler pressed ahead, convinced that the new weapons would be decisive. This tension between urgency and preparation would prove to be a critical factor when the battle finally began. By the time summer approached, the stage was set. On one side stood the German army, still deadly and equipped with some of the most advanced tanks and weapons of the war, but stretched thin and gambling on one great strike to regain momentum. On the other side stood the Soviet Union, deeply entrenched, armed with vast reserves, and determined to prove that Stalingrad was not an isolated victory, but the beginning of a permanent shift in the war. The Kursk salient, with its peculiar geography and strategic importance, had become the focal point of both hopes and fears. Soldiers on both sides sensed that the coming clash would be extraordinary in scale and ferocity, though none could yet imagine just how immense the destruction would be. Thus, As spring gave way to summer in 1943, the armies of Germany and the Soviet Union stood poised, staring across no man's land, each preparing for a battle that would define the future of the Eastern Front. The road to Kursk was not merely paved with military calculations, but with the weight of ideology, desperation, and the relentless determination of two powers locked in a struggle that seemed to grow only more colossal with each passing season. Chapter 2: The Strategic Dilemma. Hitler's Gamble and Stalin's Patience. The aftermath of Stalingrad and the counteroffensives of early 1943 left both the German and Soviet high commands facing profound strategic dilemmas. Neither side could afford to remain passive, yet neither could rush forward blindly without risking catastrophic losses. The great bulge in the front lines around Kursk became the pivot around which those dilemmas revolved, and the way each side approached this salient revealed much about their respective leaders, their resources, and their philosophies of war. For Hitler, the Eastern Front was no longer the swift campaign of conquest he had envisioned when Operation Barbarossa was launched in 1941. 2 years of relentless struggle had drained Germany's manpower and equipment. Still, he clung to the idea that a decisive battle might restore the initiative and alter the strategic balance. He saw in the Kursk salient both danger and opportunity. The danger was obvious. The bulge placed German flanks at risk, providing the Soviets with a potential springboard for offensives deeper into occupied territory. The opportunity, however, was equally tempting. By attacking from both north and south, the Wehrmacht could close the salient and encircle large Soviet forces, delivering a blow reminiscent of earlier victories, such as Kiev in 1941, yet the very factors that made the salient attractive also made the plan risky. The Soviet Red Army was no longer the poorly coordinated force of 1941. It had grown in confidence and competence, and Soviet industry had achieved a scale of production that dwarfed German capabilities. Moreover, Hitler's generals were divided over the wisdom of launching another large-scale offensive. Men like General Heinz Guderian, who had returned as inspector of armored troops, warned that the German tank arm was still recovering from losses and that the new Panther tanks were untested. Guderian famously remarked that the Eastern Front devours everything, suggesting that launching Operation Citadel, as the Kursk offensive was named, might consume Germany's last reserves without guaranteeing success. Nevertheless, Hitler was resolute. He believed that the prestige of the Wehrmacht and the faith of the German people required a dramatic victory. He dismissed defensive strategies as uninspiring and feared that a failure to strike would embolden the Soviets. His decision was as much political as military, shaped by the need to reassure allies and maintain control over a war effort that was beginning to show signs of strain. By choosing to gamble at Kursk, Hitler revealed his increasing tendency to ignore professional military advice and to place faith in technology, particularly the promise of new weapons like the Panther tank and the Ferdinand assault gun, to deliver victory on the Soviet side. Joseph Stalin and his commanders faced a different, but equally weighty dilemma. Their victory at Stalingrad had been immense, but the Red Army had overextended itself in the subsequent offensives, suffering setbacks in the spring. Now they were presented with intelligence suggesting that the Germans intended to attack the Kursk salient. The question was whether to preempt the Germans with an offensive of their own or to prepare for defense and await the blow. Stalin, ever aggressive by nature, initially leaned toward striking first. Yet his senior generals, men like Georgy Zhukov, Alexander Vasilevsky, and Konstantin Rokossovsky, advised caution. They argued that it was better to let the Germans come, to force them into attacking prepared positions, and then to launch counteroffensives once the enemy had been weakened. this was not an easy choice. The Soviet Union had often paid dearly for allowing the Germans to seize the initiative. But by 1943, the balance of power was shifting and the Red Army was strong enough to absorb an assault. The general's advice reflected a growing sophistication in Soviet strategy. Rather than relying solely on mass attacks, they now emphasized defense in depth, attrition, and coordinated reserves. For Stalin, who had once distrusted his generals, the decision to heed their counsel represented a significant shift. It showed that the Soviet leadership was learning from past mistakes and maturing in its command style. The divergent choices made by Hitler and Stalin in the spring of 1943 thus set the stage for the battle to come. Hitler chose to gamble on offense, hoping for a decisive encirclement that would break Soviet momentum. Stalin chose patience, agreeing to let the Germans strike and thereby create the conditions for a devastating counterstroke. Each leader placed faith in different strengths. Hitler in new weapons and the traditional daring of German maneuver warfare, Stalin in the vast depth of Soviet resources and the painstaking construction of defensive fortifications. This clash of philosophies was more than just a contest of military plans. It reflected the broader character of the war on the Eastern Front. For Germany, the war was increasingly a desperate gamble to snatch victory from looming defeat, reliant on innovation and boldness to compensate for dwindling resources. For the Soviet Union, the war was a test of endurance, of patience and mass mobilization, of grinding down the invader with the sheer weight of men and material. Kursk would test both visions to the utmost, and in doing so, it would reveal which path had the greater chance of success in the long and brutal struggle still to come. As spring 1943 wore on, the German High Command became increasingly entangled in debates over how, when, and even whether to launch Operation Citadel. Hitler's obsession with the offensive clashed with the doubts of his generals. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the architect of the counterstroke at Kharkov, initially supported the idea of a limited attack, but warned that further delays would erode Germany's chances. General Walter Model, tasked with leading the northern pincer of the assault, worried that Soviet defenses were becoming too strong. Even Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments, expressed concern about the strain placed on production lines to deliver the promised new tanks in time. The longer the decision was postponed, the more difficult the task became. Yet Hitler hesitated repeatedly, waiting for reinforcements of armor that he believed essential for success. The Panther tank, in particular, loomed large in these calculations. Designed to counter the Soviet T-34, it combined thick-sloped armor with a powerful 75mm gun. On paper, it promised superiority over any Soviet tank. However, by early 1943, only a handful were operational, and mechanical problems plagued the prototypes. The Ferdinand tank destroyer, with its massive 88mm gun and nearly impenetrable armor, was another weapon Hitler pinned his hopes on, though it too was untested in battle. Guderian, responsible for overseeing armored development, openly doubted the wisdom of basing an entire offensive on unproven machines. "The tanks are not ready," he warned, but his voice carried little weight against Hitler's determination that on the Soviet side, preparations were accelerating with remarkable intensity. Once Stalin accepted the plan to remain on the defensive, the Red Army began to construct defensive zones that would become legendary for their depth and resilience. Soviet intelligence, aided by partisan reports and British decrypts, tracked German troop movements and confirmed the concentration of forces opposite the Kursk salient. Every day that Hitler delayed, Soviet engineers dug deeper, sowed more mines, and fortified more positions. By the summer, The Red Army had laid nearly 2 million mines, deployed countless anti-tank guns, and built trench systems stretching for thousands of kilometers. The salient was being transformed into a fortress designed to bleed the Germans dry. This disparity in preparation reflected the broader strategic philosophies of the two sides. Germany was attempting to recreate the decisive encirclements of 1941, relying on speed, surprise, and tactical brilliance. But the conditions of 1943 were different. The Soviets had learned from past defeats, and their defenses were layered in a way that ensured no single breakthrough could collapse the entire line. Moreover, Soviet industry was producing tanks, planes, and artillery at a pace that Germany could not match. Even if the Germans achieved initial success, the Red Army's reserves threatened to turn any short-term gain into a long-term drain. Stalin, for his part, displayed a new kind of patience. In 1941 and 1942, his interference in military planning had often led to costly blunders. But by 1943, he had come to trust his top commanders more fully. Men like Zhukov and Vasilevsky were given the authority to shape strategy, and they carefully crafted a plan that combined defensive endurance with offensive ambition. They accepted that Soviet forces in the salient would endure heavy losses, but trusted that the depth of defenses and the size of reserves would ultimately wear down the German attack. Once that moment came, the Soviets planned to launch powerful counteroffensives, not just to repel the enemy, but to liberate occupied territory and press the war westward. Meanwhile, on the German side, morale among officers was uneven. Some still believed in the possibility of a decisive victory, pointing to the Wehrmacht's record of battlefield skill. Others feared that Hitler's fixation on Kursk was a strategic error, one that ignored the broader realities of Germany's position. By mid-1943, Germany was facing increasing pressure on multiple fronts. Allied bombers hammered industrial centers. Italy wavered in its alliance, and in the Atlantic, the U-boat campaign was faltering. Yet Hitler clung to the belief that a spectacular triumph in the East could stabilize the situation, restore confidence, and perhaps deter the Allies from opening a second front in Western Europe. This convergence of determination and doubt, of preparation and delay, defined the strategic dilemma of 1943. The Germans sought a decisive battle, but risked walking into a trap of their own making. The Soviets, once reckless in their offensives, now embraced patience and defense, confident that the enemy would break himself on their fortifications. Each day that passed brought the two armies closer to collision, and each decision made in those months, whether by Hitler in his headquarters or Stalin in the Kremlin, shaped the course of the battle to come. Kursk would not simply be the largest clash of armor in history. It would be the testing ground of two philosophies of war, the gamble of one man against the patience of another. Chapter 3. The Kursk Salient. Geography, planning, and fortification. The defining feature of the battlefield in the summer of 1943 was not just the armies or the weapons, but the land itself. Geography shaped the course of the Battle of Kursk as much as strategy or leadership, and the peculiar bulge in the front lines became the very heart of the confrontation. To appreciate how the conflict unfolded, it is important to understand the shape, terrain, and preparations that turned a region of farmland and villages into one of the most heavily fortified zones in military history. The Kursk Salient, as it came to be called, was the result of the Soviet winter offensives of 1942 to 43. Stretching about 250 kilometers from north to south and about 160 kilometers from east to west, it protruded into German-held territory like a wedge. Its northern shoulder pointed toward Orel, held by the German Ninth Army under General Walter Model, while its southern shoulder extended toward Kharkov, where Field Marshal Hermann Haas' 4th Panzer Army and General Paul Hausser's 2 SS Panzer Corps were stationed. At its center lay the city of Kursk, a regional hub connected by roads and railways, making it a strategically vital position for both sides. The salient was both an opportunity and a vulnerability. For the Germans, it seemed to invite encirclement. By striking from north and south, they could pinch off the bulge and trap Soviet forces inside. For the Soviets, however, it provided a chance to construct layered defenses, deliberately inviting the enemy into a carefully prepared trap. Thus, geography became the starting point for all the planning that followed, shaping how both sides envisioned the coming battle. The terrain itself presented challenges and advantages. The Kursk region was characterized by rolling plains, scattered forests, and open farmland. In summer, the ground was firm, ideal for the movement of tanks and mechanized units, while in spring or autumn, the rains turned the soil into mud, bogging down even the most powerful machines. Small rivers, streams, and ravines crisscrossed the landscape, sometimes offering natural obstacles, but more often serving as little more than minor hindrances. For the most part, it was terrain suited to armored warfare, with long fields of fire and few places to hide. Yet those same open expanses could be turned into killing zones with well-placed mines, anti-tank guns, and artillery. The Soviets recognized this potential early and set about transforming the salient into an impregnable fortress. Under the guidance of Generals Zhukov, Vasilevsky, and Rokossovsky, the Red Army constructed one of the most elaborate defensive systems of the entire war. Civilians and soldiers alike worked tirelessly to dig trenches, bunkers, and firing positions. It was a massive collective effort, often undertaken under harsh conditions, with men and women laboring day and night to prepare for the storm they knew was coming. By July 1943, the Soviets had created 8 defensive belts in depth, each filled with minefields, anti-tank ditches, wire obstacles, and artillery zones. Behind these belts were mobile reserves, ready to counterattack when the Germans were most exhausted. The scale of the defensive preparations was staggering. Nearly 2 million mines, both anti-personnel and anti-tank, were laid across the salient, making it the most heavily mined battlefield in history up to that point. Entire fields were wired with explosives, ready to shred advancing infantry and halt armored thrusts. Trenches stretched for thousands of kilometers, dug in zigzag patterns to reduce vulnerability to artillery. Machine gun nests, mortar pits, and hidden bunkers dotted the landscape, all carefully camouflaged. Anti-tank guns were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire, ensuring that any armored breakthrough would be met with devastating resistance. The Soviets also dug communication trenches, supply routes, and fallback positions, creating a defense in depth that was not just strong but also flexible. Equally important was the Soviet use of deception. Camouflage was employed on a massive scale, with dummy positions, fake tanks, and false artillery batteries constructed to confuse German reconnaissance. Real units were carefully concealed, often hidden in forests or villages, making it difficult for German aerial photography to discern the true strength of the defenses. Radio deception added another layer, feeding the Germans misleading information about troop deployments. The result was that while the Germans knew the salient was heavily fortified, they underestimated just how deep and deadly those defenses were. The Germans, for their part, planned to unleash the power of their armored spearheads against this fortress. They concentrated some of their best divisions for the task, including elite Waffen-SS units and newly equipped armored formations. Their plan relied on the ability of the Tiger and Panther tanks to smash through Soviet lines, supported by massive artillery bombardments and the Luftwaffe's air power. But what the German commanders did not fully appreciate was how well the Soviets had prepared the battlefield to neutralize exactly those strengths. By early July 1943, the Kursk salient had become more than a bulge on a map. It was a fortress, a trap, and a testing ground. The open fields and rolling hills, once quiet farmland, had been transformed into a labyrinth of mines, trenches, and hidden guns. Both armies knew that the coming battle would be colossal, but the Soviets had the advantage of time and preparation. They had turned geography into a weapon, waiting for the Germans to make the first move into the carefully constructed killing grounds. As the Soviet defensive works grew in scale and complexity, German planners continued to refine Operation Citadel, convinced that the bulge around Kursk could be the key to restoring the initiative. Yet geography, far from being a neutral backdrop, increasingly favored the defenders. The salient was wide and deep, meaning that the Germans would need to advance over long distances to close it, exposing their forces to extended attrition. Every kilometer they gained would require breaching yet another belt of defenses, sapping their strength long before they could hope to meet one another in the center. For the Soviets, this was precisely the intention: to turn the salient into a grinder where German armor would be worn down mile by mile. The planning on both sides was shaped by the understanding that Kursk would not be a battle of maneuver alone, but one of preparation, attrition, and endurance. Hitler and his generals sought to concentrate their most powerful formations at the tips of the pincers. In the north, Model's Ninth Army would strike south from the Orel region. In the south, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, supported by Hausser's 2 SS Panzer Corps, would drive north from the Belgorod-Kharkov axis. Their aim was to converge near Kursk, cutting off Soviet forces in the bulge and collapsing the front. But this seemingly simple plan was already complicated by geography. The northern shoulder of the salient was narrower, with forested areas that limited maneuver, while the southern shoulder offered broader avenues of advance across open terrain, more favorable to tank warfare. This asymmetry meant that the two German pincers would develop differently, complicating coordination and leaving little room for error. The Soviets exploited these geographical realities to their advantage. In the north, they built defenses thicker and deeper, anticipating that Model's infantry-heavy forces would struggle to advance. In the south, where German armor was expected to strike hardest, they prepared vast minefields and anti-tank zones designed to slow and break the momentum of the panzer spearheads. Behind the forward lines, they stationed strong reserves, including tank armies, ready to launch counterblows at precisely the moment when German forces had become bogged down and overextended. The defensive belts were thus not static walls, but dynamic zones, designed to delay, channel, and ultimately trap the attacker. That it was not only the ground, but also the infrastructure of the Kursk region that played a role in shaping the battle. Railways and roads radiated from the city of Kursk, making it a logistical hub of great importance. For the Soviets, holding the city ensured steady supply lines to the front. For the Germans, capturing Kursk promised to disrupt Soviet communications and open the way for deeper thrusts into the rear. Both sides recognized that the geography of roads and rail was as decisive as the contours of the land itself. Soviet planners positioned railheads and depots just beyond the range of German artillery, while German staff officers meticulously mapped routes for moving fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts for their tanks across the steppe. In a battle expected to consume enormous amounts of resources, logistics became as much a part of the planning as tactics. Beyond the physical geography, the psychological landscape of the salient also mattered. For Soviet soldiers digging trenches and laying mines, there was a sense of grim determination. They knew that this land had been fought over before, that villages had changed hands multiple times, and that their labor might determine whether the Germans could advance or be stopped. The Germans, too, viewed the salient with symbolic importance. It represented both a threat to their front lines and an opportunity to strike a blow that might erase the humiliation of Stalingrad. Maps in command headquarters showed the bulge jutting into German lines like a dagger, and Hitler spoke of straightening the front by eliminating it. Geography had become not just a military factor, but a psychological one, shaping the expectations of leaders and soldiers alike. By late June, the two sides had created a battlefield unlike any seen before. The Soviets had prepared their defenses in staggering depth, using geography and manpower to construct what was, in effect, a layered fortress stretching across hundreds of kilometers. The Germans had assembled one of the largest concentrations of armored power ever seen, banking on their ability to smash through. The Kursk salient had become a magnet pulling both armies toward collision. Its rolling fields, railways, and villages were no longer just features of the land, but the stage upon which the fate of the Eastern Front would soon be decided. The land itself had been weaponized, transformed into an instrument of war, and both sides prepared to test their strength against it. Chapter 4. Operation Citadel. The German plan for decisive victory. By the spring of 1943, the German High Command faced one of the most complex strategic choices of the entire war. Operation Citadel, the plan to strike at the Kursk salient, was presented as a bold maneuver that could restore the Wehrmacht's prestige after the crushing defeat at Stalingrad. Yet from the very beginning, the plan was shadowed by doubts, disagreements, and delays. Inside Hitler's war councils, discussions swung between confidence in German armor and fear of Soviet preparedness. The result was a plan that looked brilliant on paper, but grew more problematic with every passing week. The concept of Operation Citadel originated in the weeks following the German counteroffensive around Kharkov in March 1943, where Manstein's forces had regained ground and inflicted heavy losses on the Red Army. This success emboldened Hitler and the High Command to consider one last major offensive in the east before the Soviets could rebuild. The salient around Kursk offered itself as the most obvious target, a protrusion in the Soviet line that looked vulnerable to encirclement. German generals argued that by cutting it off with a northern thrust from Orel and a southern thrust from Kharkov, they could trap hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops and regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. Hitler's interest in the plan was as much political as military. A decisive victory at Kursk, he believed, would restore the aura of German invincibility that had been tarnished by the twin disasters of Stalingrad and North Africa. It would also demonstrate to both allies and enemies that the Wehrmacht remained capable of mounting large-scale offensives. For Hitler, prestige was as important as strategy. He knew that wavering allies such as Italy and Hungary needed reassurance, and he feared that without a bold stroke, the momentum of the war would turn irreversibly against Germany. The generals who shaped Citadel envisioned the operation as a classic double envelopment. General Walter Model's Ninth Army would strike from the north, pushing southward toward Kursk. Simultaneously, General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, spearheaded by Hausser's elite 2 SS Panzer Corps, would advance northward from the Belgorod region. If both pincers succeeded, they would meet near Kursk, cutting off the Soviet Central and Voronezh fronts. The encircled forces would be annihilated, and the front line would be straightened, creating a shorter and more defensible position for Germany. On paper, the plan resembled earlier German triumphs, such as the encirclement battles of 1941, when vast Soviet armies had been trapped and destroyed at Kiev and Smolensk. Yet the situation in 1943 was profoundly different. The Soviets were no longer inexperienced or disorganized. They had learned from past defeats, improved their tactics, and reorganized their forces. Intelligence suggested that the Red Army was preparing in depth, constructing defenses that dwarfed anything the Wehrmacht had faced before. Despite these warnings, many German officers still placed great faith in the technological superiority of their new weapons, particularly the Panther and Tiger tanks. They believed that these armored giants, supported by Ferdinand tank destroyers and massed artillery, could smash through Soviet lines regardless of the defenses. But as weeks passed, the operation faced repeated delays. Originally scheduled for early May, the offensive was postponed again and again, as Hitler insisted on waiting until sufficient numbers of the new Panthers and Ferdinands were ready for action. Each delay, however, gave the Soviets precious time to strengthen their defenses. By June, entire belts of trenches, bunkers, and minefields had been laid down, turning the Kursk salient into a fortress. German field commanders like Manstein and Guderian warned that the window of opportunity was closing. Guderian in particular expressed skepticism about the entire venture, famously asking, "Why attack a hedgehog?" He argued that it was senseless to batter against such strong defenses when Germany could no longer afford heavy losses. Despite misgivings, the machinery of war moved inexorably forward. By late June, the German buildup was immense. More than 2,700 tanks and assault guns, 2,000 aircraft, and nearly 1,000,000 men were concentrated for the operation. The Ninth Army in the north fielded large numbers of infantry and assault guns, while the southern thrust boasted the cream of German panzer divisions, including the Leibstandard, Das Reich, and Totenkopf SS divisions. Hitler personally reviewed the forces, inspecting the new Tigers and Panthers with satisfaction. To him, these machines symbolized the renewed might of the Wehrmacht and the key to overcoming Soviet resistance. Yet within the German high command, unease lingered. The operation relied heavily on rapid breakthroughs and encirclement, but if the Soviets managed to delay or blunt the spearheads, the entire plan could collapse into a costly slugging match. The dependence on untested new tanks added to the risk. Many Panthers and Ferdinands were rushed into service with mechanical flaws not yet resolved. Moreover, the Luftwaffe, once supreme in the skies, faced increasing challenges from a revitalized Soviet Air Force. The balance of power on the Eastern Front was shifting, and many German commanders sensed it. Even if Hitler refused to admit it, the start date was finally fixed for early July 1943. Operation Citadel stood as both a gamble and a statement of intent. For the Germans, it was a chance to deliver a decisive blow and regain the initiative. For the Soviets, it was an opportunity to absorb the attack and then strike back on their own terms. The stage was set, but the outcome remained uncertain. In the tension of those final days before the offensive, both armies braced themselves for what would become the largest armored battle in history. The final days leading up to Operation Citadel revealed as much about German anxieties as they did about German confidence. By early July, troops were in position, fuel and ammunition had been stockpiled, and the front along the Kursk salient crackled with anticipation. German soldiers received briefings emphasizing the importance of the coming offensive, often couched in grandiose terms. Officers spoke of a decisive strike that would restore the initiative and secure victory, echoing Hitler's own rhetoric. Yet in the private thoughts of many commanders, doubts loomed large. They knew that the Soviets were aware of the coming attack, and that the delay had allowed them to prepare defenses on a scale never before encountered. The problem was not only Soviet preparedness, but also the inherent fragility of German resources by 1943. Although Citadel concentrated nearly 1 million men and thousands of tanks, these numbers masked the fact that Germany could ill afford to replace its losses. Every Panther destroyed or Tiger immobilized by a mechanical breakdown was not easily replaced. Unlike in 1941, when production could outpace attrition, the German war economy was straining to keep up with the vast consumption of men and material on the Eastern Front. Hitler's gamble required not only success, but swift success, for a drawn-out struggle would bleed Germany in ways it could no longer sustain on the Soviet side. Intelligence had provided a remarkably clear picture of German intentions. Thanks to reconnaissance, intercepted communications, and information from partisans behind German lines, the Red Army was aware not only of the broad outlines of Citadel, but also of its timing and strength. Stalin and his generals debated fiercely over how to respond. Some, like Marshal Zhukov, urged a defensive strategy. Let the Germans crash against the fortified belts, absorb their blows, and then unleash a counteroffensive once the enemy was weakened. Others favored preemptive attacks to disrupt Citadel before it could begin. Stalin, after some hesitation, sided with Zhukov. The result was one of the most elaborate defensive preparations in military history. By the time the Germans were ready to launch Citadel, the Soviets had constructed multiple defensive belts stretching up to 190 miles in depth. Each belt bristled with minefields, anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, bunkers, and camouflaged gun positions. Artillery was carefully sited to cover likely avenues of German advance, while tank reserves were concealed behind the lines, ready to counterattack. Soviet engineers laid over 400,000 mines, an unprecedented density that would slow German armor and channel it into killing zones. Behind these defenses, Soviet tank armies waited, prepared to exploit the moment when German momentum inevitably faltered. Meanwhile, the German reliance on new technology carried risks that soon became apparent. The Panther tank, designed with thick armor and a powerful 75mm gun, was formidable in theory but plagued with mechanical issues. Many broke down before even reaching the front. The Ferdinand, a heavy tank destroyer with unmatched firepower, suffered from a critical design flaw. It lacked a defensive machine gun, leaving it vulnerable to infantry armed with grenades and Molotov cocktails. Hitler had insisted that these new weapons would turn the tide, but field commanders worried that their numbers would be too few and their reliability too uncertain to carry the operation. Despite these concerns, morale within elite formations like the 2 SS Panzer Corps remained high. The soldiers of Leibstandard, Das Reich, and Totenkopf had a reputation for ferocity and discipline, and they trusted their leaders to deliver victory. In the north, Model's 9th Army prepared to grind through Soviet defenses with infantry and artillery, while in the south, Hoth's armored divisions planned to deliver the decisive thrust. The contrast between the two pincers, one slow and methodical, the other swift and armored, mirrored the imbalance of the salient itself. Coordinating them would be a challenge, and timing would prove critical. That on July 4th, German artillery began preparatory bombardments, and reconnaissance units probed Soviet defenses. That night, flares lit up the sky, and the rumble of engines filled the air as tanks moved into position. Soldiers on both sides sensed that something historic was about to unfold. For the Germans, the night carried both tension and hope, the belief that their superior tactics and machines could still deliver a decisive blow. For the Soviets, it was a moment of grim anticipation, knowing that their months of preparation would soon be put to the test. As dawn broke on July 5th, the full force of Operation Citadel was unleashed. Across the northern and southern fronts of the salient, German artillery thundered, tanks surged forward, and aircraft roared overhead. But almost immediately, the challenges became apparent. Soviet defenses absorbed the initial shock, minefields slowed the armored thrusts, and fierce resistance erupted from every trench and gun emplacement. The battle that began that day was no swift encirclement in the style of 1941. Instead, it was the beginning of a titanic struggle that would last weeks, consume vast resources, and reshape the course of the war on the Eastern Front. Operation Citadel was, at its heart, a gamble born of desperation and ambition. It revealed both the enduring strengths of the German military, its ability to concentrate power, innovate technologically, and execute complex maneuvers, and the growing weaknesses that would eventually doom it. By seeking to crush the Kursk salient, Hitler had set in motion one of the largest clashes of arms in human history. Whether it would be remembered as a triumph or a catastrophe would soon be decided on the fields of Kursk. Chapter 5. The Soviet Response. Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and the Art of Defense. The Soviet response to Operation Citadel was not improvised in panic, nor was it simply reactive. It was, instead, a deliberate, meticulously crafted strategy shaped by the hard lessons of 2 years of brutal war. By the spring of 1943, Stalin and his high command had learned that victory against the Wehrmacht required patience, depth, and coordination. No longer would they rely on frontal assaults against German strength. Instead, they sought to build a defensive system so resilient that it could absorb the mightiest blow the Wehrmacht could deliver, only to turn that blow back against the attacker. At Kursk, this philosophy would reach its most complete expression. Marshal Georgy Zhukov played a central role in shaping this response. Renowned for his clarity of thought and hard-nosed realism, Zhukov argued forcefully against launching a premature offensive of his own. Many within the Soviet leadership had initially urged such a course, fearing that allowing the Germans to strike first would mean ceding initiative. But Zhukov, together with generals Alexander Vasilevsky and Konstantin Rokossovsky, persuaded Stalin that patience would yield the greater prize. By waiting, the Soviets could let the Germans expend themselves against defenses prepared in depth, while preserving their own strength for a decisive counteroffensive. It was, in many ways, a reversal of 1941, when the Red Army had been unprepared for the German onslaught. Now, it was the Germans who would find themselves plunging into a trap. The Soviet approach rested on 3 pillars: intelligence, fortification, and reserves. First, intelligence provided the foundation. Soviet commanders were astonishingly well informed about German intentions. Partisans behind German lines reported troop movements and supply dumps. Reconnaissance flights revealed concentrations of armor and artillery. Most importantly, British intelligence shared information from the breaking of German codes, known as Ultra, which confirmed the scale and objectives of Citadel. With this knowledge, Soviet planners could anticipate not just the direction of the German strikes, but also their approximate timing. It was a rare moment in warfare when one side enjoyed such clarity about the other's plans. Fortification came next, and here the Soviets displayed both ingenuity and sheer endurance. Across the Kursk salient, they built a defensive system of unprecedented depth. The first belt alone included trenches, minefields, anti-tank ditches, and fortified strongpoints. Behind it stretched successive belts, each designed to slow and exhaust the enemy. Artillery was positioned with overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that German breakthroughs would be met with barrages from multiple directions. Engineers laid more than 1 million mines, both anti-tank and anti-personnel, creating belts of explosive obstacles that forced German armor into narrow corridors of advance. Villages were fortified as strongpoints, with houses converted into bunkers and cellars reinforced as shelters. It was not a single line but a layered web of defenses capable of bending without breaking. The third pillar, reserves, was the most critical. Soviet planners knew that no defense, however formidable, could hold indefinitely against concentrated German armor. What mattered was buying time and space for reserves to intervene at the decisive moment. To this end, tank armies and mechanized corps were held back, hidden in wooded areas or dispersed to avoid detection. These forces included the 5th Guards Tank Army under General Pavel Rotmistrov, a formation that would later become famous for its role in the battle's climax. The presence of such reserves meant that even if the Germans broke through the initial belts, they would face fresh Soviet forces striking back at the moment of their greatest vulnerability. Central to this defensive vision was the leadership of Konstantin Rokossovsky, commander of the Central Front, which held the northern sector of the Salient. Rokossovsky was a man of immense resilience, both physical and mental. Years earlier, during Stalin's purges, he had been imprisoned, tortured, and only narrowly spared execution. Yet he emerged not embittered but determined, earning respect from both soldiers and peers for his calm, deliberate style of command. At Kursk, Rokossovsky faced the challenge of containing Model's Ninth Army, with its vast numbers of infantry and assault guns. He organized his defenses in layers, ensuring that even if the first line bent under pressure, subsequent lines would bleed the attackers further. His confidence rested not on the hope of holding every inch of ground, but on the certainty that every German advance would come at a terrible price. In the southern sector, responsibility fell to General Nikolai Vatutin, commanding the Voronezh front. Vatutin, younger and more daring than Rokossovsky, embraced innovation and bold counterattacks. He anticipated the armored thrust of Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and prepared accordingly. His defenses featured dense minefields and concealed anti-tank positions, designed to break the momentum of German armor before unleashing counterblows from tank reserves. Vatutin's energy and willingness to adapt made him a formidable opponent, though his approach sometimes led to higher casualties. The contrast between Rokossovsky's methodical defense and Vatutin's aggressive flexibility would shape the course of the battle as it unfolded. Stalin, for his part, was unusually cautious during this period. Whereas in earlier campaigns he had often pressed for premature offensives, at Kursk he heeded the advice of his generals. This restraint marked a turning point in Soviet command culture. The Stavka, or High Command, functioned more as a collective body than ever before, with Zhukov and Vasilevsky exercising significant influence. The decision to allow the Germans to strike first was not an abdication of initiative, but a carefully calculated trap. In this sense, Kursk reflected the growing maturity of Soviet strategy, a shift from reactive desperation to deliberate, long-term planning. By early July 1943, the Soviet defenses were ready. Soldiers dug into their trenches, gunners checked their sights, and tank crews waited in concealed positions. Across the salient, there was a sense of grim anticipation. Many had fought through the horrors of 1941 and 1942. They knew the ferocity of the German attack that was coming. But they also knew that this time, the Red Army was not the same. This time, they were prepared, and they believed that the sacrifices of months of backbreaking labor would soon bear fruit. The trap was set, and the Germans were about to walk into it. The depth of Soviet planning before Kursk cannot be overstated. For the first time in the war, the Red Army was not scrambling to react to German moves, but actively shaping the battlefield to its advantage. This transformation was not merely tactical, but psychological. Soldiers who had once retreated in confusion across the steppes of 1941 now stood behind belts of defenses they had built themselves, their confidence reinforced by the knowledge that their commanders had a clear strategy. The symbolism mattered. Kursk was not just another battle. It was the chance to prove that the Soviet Union could meet the Wehrmacht head-on and prevail. Marshal Zhukov's influence extended beyond the purely military. His stern authority helped ensure that Stalin trusted his generals, a trust that had often been absent in earlier campaigns. Stalin still demanded updates and still weighed in on decisions, but the days when he issued rash orders ignoring military realities were fading. At Kursk, the Stavka functioned with a discipline that reflected both Stalin's growing pragmatism and the professional credibility of commanders like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Vatutin. This coordination was critical because the defensive system at Kursk was not one man's idea, but the collective vision of a command structure that had finally matured under fire. The Soviet plan also relied heavily on deception and camouflage. Entire divisions were concealed in forests, with tanks hidden under branches and dummy positions erected to mislead German reconnaissance. Artillery was carefully masked, and movement often took place at night to avoid detection by German aircraft. Radio deception added to the fog, with false transmissions designed to suggest troop concentrations where none existed. These measures ensured that, despite their extensive intelligence, German commanders underestimated the true depth of Soviet defenses and the size of the reserves waiting behind them. What appeared to be a single line of fortifications was in reality only the surface of a defensive system designed to absorb and then annihilate. Equally important was the human element. Soviet soldiers endured unimaginable hardships preparing the battlefield. Civilians were mobilized to assist in digging trenches and laying mines, with peasants laboring side by side with soldiers to construct defenses stretching for hundreds of miles. Women and children carried earth, timber, and barbed wire, turning the land itself into a weapon. These efforts created a sense of collective purpose, a recognition that the defense of the motherland was not the task of the army alone, but of the entire people. This fusion of civilian and military effort gave the defenses a solidity that extended beyond physical structures. It embodied the determination of a nation that refused to be conquered again. Among the commanders, Rokossovsky epitomized the Soviet approach to defense in depth. He understood that the Germans would achieve tactical breakthroughs. Resisting them everywhere was impossible. Instead, he organized his forces to absorb the initial blows, then counterattack at carefully chosen moments. His calm demeanor inspired confidence among his subordinates, and his willingness to delegate allowed for flexibility on the battlefield. Rokossovsky's troops knew that their role was not to hold every trench, but to bleed the Germans until the reserves could strike. This realistic understanding of defense marked a stark contrast with the rigid, not one step back, orders of 1941. Vatutin, commanding the Southern Front, displayed a more aggressive temperament. He prepared his defenses with the same thoroughness, but envisioned a more dynamic use of his tank reserves. His staff planned counterattacks designed not merely to halt the Germans, but to strike at their flanks and disrupt their momentum. Vatutin's sector would see some of the fiercest fighting of the entire battle, where elite German armored divisions collided with Soviet tank armies in duels of speed, firepower, and attrition. His approach carried risks, but it also reflected the growing confidence of the Red Army in its ability to meet German armor on equal terms. The presence of General Pavel Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army behind Vatutin's lines symbolized this confidence. Unlike earlier Soviet offensives that hurled tanks forward in reckless charges, Rotmistrov's forces were to be committed carefully at the point where German strength began to falter. Their role was decisive, to transform the German advance into a stalemate and then into a rout. This concept of the counterstroke, time to exploit the enemy's exhaustion, was a hallmark of Soviet operational art as it evolved during the war. At Kursk, it would be tested on a scale never before attempted. The Soviet Air Force, too, had been integrated into the plan with unprecedented precision. Once derided for its disorganization, the Red Air Force now coordinated closely with ground operations. Fighters were tasked not only with defending the skies, but also with protecting specific sectors of the battlefield from German air attack. Bombers were assigned to strike German assembly areas and supply lines. Though the Luftwaffe still retained considerable strength, the Soviets were prepared to contest air superiority in a way that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. This integration of air and ground power reflected the increasing sophistication of Soviet military doctrine. By July 4th, the defensive preparations were complete. Soviet troops stood ready in their trenches, weapons cleaned and ammunition stacked. Behind them, tank crews waited for the order to move, while artillerymen checked their guns one last time. There was no illusion about what lay ahead. Everyone understood that the German attack would be ferocious, that casualties would be heavy, and that the first lines might be overrun. Yet there was also a quiet confidence, born of preparation and unity. For the first time in the war, the Red Army was not stepping blindly into disaster, but waiting, ready, for the enemy to come to them. The atmosphere on the eve of battle was one of both tension and determination. Soldiers wrote letters home, some for the last time, while commissars reminded them of the stakes. This was not just a battle for Kursk, but for the future of the war itself. German soldiers believed they were striking to restore their fortunes. Soviet soldiers knew they were defending the path to ultimate victory. The trap had been laid, and as the first German shells began to fall on the morning of July 5th, the defenders braced themselves to test whether their months of preparation would hold. Chapter 6. The Opening Clash, July 5, 1943. The morning of July 5, 1943, broke with a thunder that shook the earth across the Kursk salient. The long-anticipated clash of Operation Citadel had begun. For weeks, German and Soviet forces had waited, each knowing that the other was preparing for a decisive test. When the battle finally erupted, it was not with the swift encirclements of 1941, but with a storm of fire that announced the largest set-piece confrontation the world had yet seen. From the first hours, the struggle was marked by intensity, attrition, and the weight of preparation, setting the tone for what would become a battle of endurance rather than maneuver. Interestingly, the Soviets struck first. Thanks to intelligence and reconnaissance, they had advance warning of the German timetable. On the night of July 4th and the early hours of July 5th, Soviet artillery opened a preemptive bombardment against German assembly areas. Thousands of guns unleashed shells on suspected positions of tanks, artillery, and infantry, hoping to disrupt the German attack before it could properly begin. This sudden barrage caught many German troops off guard, destroying some vehicles and killing soldiers massed for the offensive. Yet the effect, though disruptive, was not decisive. The Wehrmacht absorbed the punishment, and once the barrage subsided, their own artillery responded in kind. What followed was a rolling exchange of fire that lit up the night sky and continued into dawn. When the German assault began, it was launched with massive force along both the northern and southern shoulders of the salient. In the north, General Walter Model's Ninth Army opened its attack with infantry, supported by assault guns and artillery. Thick belts of minefields and entrenched Soviet infantry awaited them. Progress was measured in meters, not kilometers, as German pioneers crept forward to clear mines under heavy fire. Villages fortified into strong points resisted fiercely, requiring prolonged fighting to capture. The northern assault, though determined, soon revealed the difficulties of battering through layered defenses in heavily fortified terrain. In the south, the attack unfolded on a grander scale. Here, General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army spearheaded the offensive, supported by the elite 2 SS Panzer Corps under General Paul Hausser. The terrain was more favorable for armored thrusts, open ground where tanks could maneuver, but the defenses were equally formidable. As the first waves of German armor advanced, they encountered dense minefields that slowed their progress. Soviet artillery rained shells on the advancing panzers, while anti-tank guns and dug-in infantry inflicted steady losses. Engineers worked frantically to clear paths, but every gap opened was covered by overlapping Soviet fire. The momentum of the blitzkrieg style seemed to grind against an immovable wall. The Luftwaffe joined the attack with hundreds of aircraft. Stukas dive-bombed Soviet positions, and fighters clashed in swirling dogfights with the Red Air Force. Yet unlike in 1941, the Soviets could contest the skies. Yak and Lag fighters intercepted German bombers, while Soviet ground attack planes harassed German armor. Air superiority was no longer a given for the Germans, and the struggle in the skies mirrored the stalemate on the ground. Fierce, costly, and indecisive in the opening hours, for the Soviet soldiers on the defensive lines, the first day was a test of endurance. Trenches shook under the impact of artillery, and waves of German infantry advanced through smoke and fire. Machine gun crews fired until their barrels overheated, while anti-tank gunners waited until panzers closed within lethal range before opening fire. Every village, ridge, and patch of ground became a battlefield. The Soviets had been ordered not to hold every inch at all costs, but to bleed the Germans as they advanced. Still, the pressure was immense, and many units were forced to fall back to secondary positions. The true strength of the defense lay not in any single line, but in the depth of the system. For German soldiers, the first day brought home the reality that Citadel would not be an easy breakthrough. Many had expected that the sheer power of the new Panthers and Tigers would blast open the front. Instead, they found themselves inching forward, repairing broken tanks, and dragging away wrecks. Losses mounted quickly, not only from combat, but from mechanical failures. In some units, as many as half the Panthers were immobilized by breakdowns within days. Crews fought on with determination, but the myth of unstoppable German armor was being challenged by the grinding resilience of Soviet defense. By the evening of July 5th, both sides had endured a day of unrelenting violence. The Germans had advanced, but only slightly, measured in kilometers at most, and at heavy cost. The Soviets had held the bulk of their lines and inflicted significant losses, though they too had suffered heavily. The battlefield was littered with burning tanks, shattered guns, and the bodies of men who had fought with extraordinary courage. Yet the decisive moment was still to come. The first day had set the pattern. The Germans would push forward with immense effort, and the Soviets would resist with equal ferocity, waiting for the moment to unleash their counterstroke. The great battle had begun, and its outcome remained far from certain. As July 5th turned into July 6th, the scale of the fighting deepened. The first day had shown both the ferocity of the German assault and the resilience of the Soviet defense. Now, the momentum of Operation Citadel hinged on whether the Wehrmacht could press its attacks through the successive belts of fortifications before Soviet reserves were fully committed. Both Hitler and Stalin understood that time was critical, But their strategies were diametrically opposed, one seeking rapid breakthrough, the other waiting to exhaust and blunt the enemy before striking back. In the north, General Model's Ninth Army continued to push forward with infantry-heavy assaults. This was not the sweeping armored thrust often associated with German operations, but a slow grind against Soviet strongholds. Minefields had proven devastating on the first day, so Model's forces redoubled their efforts to clear paths. Engineers worked under constant fire, dragging away obstacles, defusing mines, and often losing their lives in the process. Behind them, German infantry advanced into prepared kill zones. Villages such as Panayrai became centers of resistance, where every house, school, and railway station was fortified and contested in brutal close-quarters combat. German artillery and Stuka dive bombers reduced much of the landscape to rubble, yet the Soviets clung on. What should have been a swift advance slowed into attritional warfare, more reminiscent of World War I than the sweeping campaigns of 1941. Meanwhile, the southern sector saw the full weight of armored warfare unleashed. Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and Hausser's 2 SS Panzer Corps sought to exploit the flatter terrain and achieve the breakthrough Hitler envisioned. Here, long columns of tanks rolled forward, Tigers and Panthers leading, followed by waves of Panzer IVs and mechanized infantry. The Soviet defenses, however, were no less formidable. Anti-tank ditches, dragon's teeth, and camouflaged gun positions forced the Germans into narrow corridors of attack. As panzers attempted to cross, they were met with coordinated barges from Soviet artillery, often guided by spotters who had survived the bombardments. Tanks burned across the fields, their crews bailing out under machine gun fire or trapped inside by flames. For the Soviets, this stage of the battle was the payoff for their months of preparation. The defense in-depth strategy meant that no single position was decisive. Even when German forces broke through the first or second defensive belts, they found fresh lines waiting. Units fell back in good order, only to resume the fight at the next fortified position. Soviet commanders rotated their forces to maintain cohesion, while reserves were fed into critical sectors to prevent collapse. The Germans, for all their skill, found themselves bleeding strength in each successive push. They could not bypass resistance as they had in earlier campaigns. Every meter of ground had to be won by fire and blood. The skies over Kursk also reflected this shifting balance of power. The Luftwaffe had committed significant resources to Citadel, with experienced pilots and advanced aircraft. But unlike in 1941 or 1942, the Soviets now met them on more equal terms. The VVS, Soviet Air Force, deployed thousands of fighters and bombers, and though their pilots often had less training, their sheer numbers, combined with growing experience, made them formidable. Dogfights swirled above the battlefield, while ground attack aircraft such as the Il-2 Sturmovik became a deadly presence. The Sturmovik, heavily armored and nicknamed the Flying Tank, strafed German tanks and infantry columns, often with devastating effect. Though the Luftwaffe struck back hard, its dominance was no longer unchallenged. This parity in the air denied the Germans one of their traditional advantages that on the ground, morale was being tested. German soldiers, many veterans of earlier campaigns, recognized that this battle was unlike any they had fought before. The expectation of swift victory gave way to the reality of attrition. Tank crews struggled with breakdowns. Supply lines grew strained as fuel and ammunition had to be dragged across shattered terrain. For Soviet troops, the knowledge that they were holding against the much-feared panzers bolstered their confidence. Each destroyed Tiger or Panther was proof that even the mightiest enemy could be stopped. Reports from the front filtered upward, convincing Soviet commanders that the German offensive, though powerful, was not unstoppable by July 7th. The offensive was in full swing, but cracks were already showing. In the north, Model's army was bogged down. The capture of Panayrai became a focal point, with German and Soviet forces trading control of the town multiple times in a series of bloody assaults. Neither side could achieve decisive control, and the fighting devolved into grinding attrition. In the south, progress was somewhat better. German armored formations had penetrated several defensive belts and were pressing toward Prokhorovka. Yet this came at a cost. Tank losses mounted, and the advance was slower than planned. Each day's delay allowed the Soviets to shift reserves into position, strengthening the lines and preparing for counterattack. For both sides, the first 3 days of the battle were a revelation. For the Germans, it was clear that the Soviet defenses were far stronger than anticipated. For the Soviets, the knowledge that their preparation had blunted the might of the Wehrmacht confirmed that their strategy was working. Stalin and his generals knew the Germans were committing their best units and most advanced equipment. If they could be worn down here, the strategic initiative might permanently shift to the Red Army. Thus, as the opening phase of the Battle of Kursk drew to a close, the situation was both dire and promising. Dire for the Germans, who had committed themselves to an offensive that was proving slower and costlier than they could afford. Promising for the Soviets, who saw their gamble on defense in depth paying off. The stage was set for the next phase. The Germans would double down on their attacks, particularly in the south, while the Soviets prepared to unleash the reserves they had so carefully husbanded. The true crucible of Kursk was yet to come, but the first days had already shown that this would not be a campaign of swift victories. It would be a test of endurance that would decide the fate of the Eastern Front. Chapter 7: Clash in the North, Model's Ninth Army and the Soviet Response. While the southern sector of the Kursk battlefront promised the possibility of sweeping armored engagements, the northern shoulder became a different kind of crucible. Here, General Walter Model's Ninth Army bore the responsibility of breaking through Soviet lines and linking with the southern thrust, completing the encirclement envisioned in Operation Citadel. The task seemed formidable from the start, for the terrain and Soviet defenses in this sector favored the defender. Yet the Ninth Army was ordered forward, and what unfolded in early July 1943 was one of the fiercest examples of positional warfare on the Eastern Front. The geography of the northern salient was less hospitable to tanks than the rolling fields of the south. Forested areas, streams, and undulating ground broke up the landscape, channeling mechanized forces into narrower avenues of advance. This naturally limited the ability of the Germans to deploy large armored spearheads. Model, often described as one of Hitler's more defensive-minded generals, compensated by relying heavily on infantry divisions, supported by assault guns, artillery, and smaller armored formations. His approach was meticulous. Rather than throwing masses of tanks against Soviet defenses, he sought to wear them down through concentrated attacks at key strongpoints. The centerpiece of these efforts quickly became Panayrai, a modest railway town that assumed outsized significance in the early days of the battle. Located along the main axis of the Ninth Army's advance, Panayrai sat astride the Orel-Kursk railway, making it a vital logistical node. The Soviets had recognized its importance and fortified it extensively. Trenches, bunkers, barbed wire, and minefields surrounded the settlement, while inside, every building was prepared for defense. Schoolhouses, factories, and railway stations were turned into mini fortresses. Soviet infantry, many from the 307th Rifle Division, dug in with grim determination, aware that Panayrai was expected to bear the full weight of the German attack. On July 5th and 6th, as the battle opened, Model's forces pressed hard toward Panayrai. Initial assaults carried them close to the outer defenses, but they met with stiff resistance. German infantry advanced cautiously through belts of mines, often under direct machine gun fire. Engineers attempted to clear paths while under constant artillery barrages. When tanks did manage to edge forward, they were quickly engaged by concealed Soviet anti-tank guns. The battlefield was alive with fire and smoke, each meter contested in brutal exchanges. The Germans unleashed Stuka dive bombers to shatter strongpoints, yet the defenders clung to the rubble, forcing attackers to fight house by house. Panayrai soon earned the nickname, the Stalingrad of the Kursk salient. The comparison was apt. Combat devolved into bitter urban fighting, with soldiers using grenades, flamethrowers, and close-quarters weapons to seize buildings. Gains were measured not in kilometers, but in individual streets. German reports described capturing the schoolhouse, only to lose it hours later to a Soviet counterattack. The railway station changed hands multiple times in a single day. Every assault brought heavy casualties, and each victory was temporary. The Soviets, having prepared fallback positions within the town itself, ensured that German forces could never consolidate their grip beyond Panayrai. The broader northern front saw similar struggles. Villages like Alkavaka became focal points of defense, with Soviet artillery emplacements covering approaches with overlapping fire. German infantry launched repeated assaults, only to be repelled by counterattacks supported by Katyusha rocket barrages. The shrieking roar of these weapons unnerved many German soldiers, who described the saturation bombardments as overwhelming. Even when German units succeeded in pushing through the first line, they immediately encountered the second and third belts of defense. The Soviets had built their lines precisely to sap momentum in this way, trading space for attrition. For Model, the frustration was acute. His army had been tasked with achieving a breakthrough, but the conditions forced him into a battle of attrition, something he had sought to avoid. Casualties mounted alarmingly, especially among the infantry divisions that bore the brunt of the fighting. At the same time, Soviet commanders skillfully rotated their defending units, ensuring that exhausted troops were relieved before collapse. Fresh reserves, drawn from the Central Front, reinforced critical points, maintaining the integrity of the defense. The German high command grew increasingly concerned. Hitler's plan for Citadel relied on coordinated progress from both the northern and southern pincers. If Model's Ninth Army could not advance rapidly, the prospect of encirclement dwindled. Yet despite intense pressure, Model could report only limited gains. By July 7th, after days of heavy fighting, the Germans had advanced a few kilometers at most. Panayrai remained contested, and Soviet defenses showed no sign of cracking. For the soldiers on the ground, the sense was clear. They were locked in a grinding battle with no easy path forward. The northern clash thus revealed a critical truth about the Battle of Kursk. The era of lightning-fast German breakthroughs was over. The Red Army had absorbed the lessons of earlier defeats and prepared a defense so deep, so resilient, that even the most determined assaults could only bleed against it. The stage was set for days more of brutal combat, but already the seeds of German failure were visible. For every meter gained, the cost grew heavier, and the promise of decisive victory receded further into the distance. As the battle in the northern sector stretched into July 7th and beyond, Panayrai remained the epicenter of the struggle. The small town became a battlefield of extraordinary intensity, drawing in divisions, artillery, and air power from both sides. For the Germans, capturing Panayrai was essential to maintain momentum. For the Soviets, holding it was symbolic as well as strategic. representing their ability to blunt the spearhead of Operation Citadel. Both armies poured men and resources into the fight, and the resulting carnage left the area in ruins. The combat environment at Panayrai was characterized by extreme density of firepower. Artillery on both sides blanketed the town, reducing structures to rubble but never fully silencing the defenders. Soviet gunners employed an innovative tactic of positioning anti-tank weapons in concealed and staggered formations, ensuring that any German breakthrough attempt was immediately enfilade by crossfire. German tank crews, even in the formidable Tigers, found themselves vulnerable when advancing into narrow streets and alleys where mines and ambushes lurked. The infantry had no easier task. Storming fortified basements or cellars required flamethrowers, grenades, and sheer persistence. The price of every building was measured in lives. Fighting here quickly resembled the desperation of Stalingrad, and German commanders began to describe Panayrai in precisely those terms. Reports told of entire companies lost in attempts to seize a single objective, only for Soviet counterattacks to retake it hours later. The railway station became a symbol of this relentless struggle, changing hands multiple times over a few days. Soviet engineers even tunneled under German positions, detonating explosives that collapsed buildings and disrupted enemy concentrations. The ferocity stunned many German soldiers, who realized they were facing not just prepared defenses, but defenders who were determined to exact maximum attrition. Elsewhere on the northern front, the picture was no less grim for the Germans. At Olkovatka, Soviet artillery dominated the high ground, raining shells onto advancing infantry. The Germans tried to bring up heavy guns and air support to suppress these positions, but the coordination required was constantly disrupted by Soviet counterbarrages and raids. Katyusha rocket launchers, with their terrifying howl and saturation fire, created shock and confusion among advancing German units. Even hardened veterans admitted to being shaken by these weapons, which could obliterate entire sections of the front in a matter of minutes. Model attempted to adjust his tactics, recognizing that a single decisive push was unlikely. He ordered repeated localized assaults, hoping to wear down the Soviet defenses by sheer pressure. Yet this played directly into the Soviet plan. Every time a German unit battered through a line, reserves were waiting. Stalin and his generals had deliberately stacked the northern shoulder with stronger defensive forces, calculating that the difficult terrain would slow the Germans further. The longer the Ninth Army remained bogged down here, the more time the Soviets would have to counter the southern threat, where the battle promised to be more mobile and decisive. The air war intensified over the northern sector as well. The Luftwaffe concentrated sorties to support Model's forces, sending Stukas and FW-190s to attack Soviet positions. But the Red Air Force was equally determined to contest the skies. Soviet Yak and La, 5 fighters tangled with German escorts, while IL-2 Sturmovix struck German armor and supply columns. The skies above Panayrai became a constant duel, with air battles raging daily and neither side gaining clear superiority. The very fact that the Soviets could challenge the Luftwaffe consistently marked a profound change from earlier years of the war. By July 9th, it was evident that Model's Ninth Army was making only marginal progress. Panayrai was half in ruins, half in Soviet hands. The Germans had expended enormous effort and suffered heavy casualties, yet they had advanced only a handful of kilometers. Villages captured at great cost were often lost again within hours. Reports from the front spoke of exhausted soldiers, dwindling ammunition, and mounting tank losses. Soviet defenses, though battered, remained intact in depth. Reserves continued to arrive, reinforcing key positions and ensuring that no German breakthrough could be sustained. The toll on German morale was significant. Many units had entered the battle confident in their ability to smash through Soviet lines, only to find themselves locked in attritional fighting they could not win quickly. Model, known for his defensive acumen, found himself trapped in an offensive he had never fully endorsed, grinding down his forces against an enemy that seemed prepared for every move. His appeals for additional support clashed with the reality that Hitler's reserves were limited and heavily committed in the south. For the Soviets, the defense of the north was more than just a tactical success. It was proof of concept. The months of preparation, the depth of fortifications, and the deliberate choice to absorb the German blow were all vindicated. Panay, though devastated, became a symbol of Soviet resilience. Holding the line there meant that the encirclement goal of Operation Citadel was slipping further from German reach. By denying model progress, the Soviets ensured that the focus of the campaign would shift increasingly to the southern sector, where the decisive clash was yet to unfold. Thus, by mid-July, the northern battle settled into stalemate. The Germans had inflicted damage, destroyed units, and caused heavy losses, but they had failed to achieve the breakthrough required. The Soviet line bent but did not break, and with every day that passed, the Red Army grew stronger. The clash in the north had demonstrated the changing balance of the Eastern Front. No longer could German armies impose their will with speed and shock. Instead, they found themselves ensnared in the very type of grinding war of attrition that they had once sought to avoid. The fate of Operation Citadel now rested on the southern thrust, where armored armies clashed in the open fields, and where the largest tank battle in history was soon to erupt. Chapter 8: Clash in the South. Hoth and Hausser drive toward Prokhorovka. While the northern shoulder of the Kursk salient became a brutal test of attrition, the southern sector promised the sweeping armored maneuvers that many expected from Operation Citadel. Here, General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and General Paul Hausser's 2 SS Panzer Corps bore the main weight of the offensive. Their mission was to drive northward through the Soviet defenses, break into open ground, and link with Model's 9th Army pressing from the north. If successful, the maneuver would close the salient, trap vast numbers of Soviet troops, and restore German strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. The stakes were immense, and both sides recognized that the outcome in the south would decide the battle. The southern terrain differed markedly from that of the north. Instead of forests and broken ground, the land here was more open, with rolling fields that seemed ideal for armored warfare. German commanders anticipated that once the minefields and defensive belts were breached, their tanks could maneuver freely and unleash the kind of mobile warfare that had defined earlier victories. To this end, they concentrated a formidable array of armored divisions, including the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd SS Panzer Divisions, Leibstandard, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, units with reputations for both military skill and ruthless determination. Alongside them were elite formations of the 4th Panzer Army, equipped with the newest models of Tigers and Panthers. The Soviets, however, were no less prepared. Anticipating that the Germans would commit their strongest forces to the southern attack, the Voronezh front under General Nikolai Vatutin had fortified the region with equal care. Multiple defensive belts stretched across the open ground, each layered with minefields, anti-tank ditches, and artillery positions. Infantry units dug deep trenches and bunkers, while mobile reserves of tanks and mechanized infantry waited behind the lines. The open terrain that seemed so favorable to the panzers also allowed Soviet gunners clear fields of fire, making every advance costly. Moreover, The Soviets had positioned their powerful 5th Guards Tank Army under General Pavel Rotmistrov in reserve, ready to counterattack at the decisive moment. The opening days of the Southern Offensive revealed just how formidable these defenses were. On July 5th, as dawn broke, German artillery and aircraft pounded Soviet positions in preparation for the assault. The ground shook under the bombardment, and smoke hung over the steppe as the armored columns rolled forward. Leading the advance were the feared Tigers, their thick armor shrugging off many Soviet shells. Behind them came waves of Panzer IVs, supported by mechanized infantry and half-tracks. Yet their momentum was immediately checked by the dense minefields. Engineers worked frantically to clear paths, often under heavy fire, while tanks attempting to force their way through triggered devastating explosions. Many vehicles were disabled before they even reached the Soviet gun lines. When the Panthers did close with Soviet positions, they encountered a storm of defensive fire. Anti-tank guns, dug into concealed pits, engaged the advancing armor with deadly precision. Soviet crews often held their fire until the Germans were within a few hundred meters, ensuring that every shot counted. The result was carnage in the killing zones. Tanks erupted in flames, infantry were cut down by machine guns, and artillery hammered the advancing formations. German commanders pushed their troops relentlessly, determined to keep pressing forward, but the cost was steep. Entire companies of tanks were reduced to wrecks in a matter of hours. Despite these obstacles, the Germans made progress, albeit slowly. The superiority of their tanks in one-on-one engagements allowed them to grind forward, knocking out Soviet armor when it appeared. Tigers in particular proved nearly invulnerable to standard Soviet anti-tank guns, forcing defenders to use massed fire or close-range tactics to bring them down. Stuka dive bombers added their weight to the assault, targeting artillery batteries and strongpoints. Yet for every position overrun, another line awaited. Soviet troops withdrew in good order to secondary defenses, leaving behind wreckage but continuing the fight from fresh positions. The intensity of the fighting escalated daily. By July 7th, the Germans had broken through the first defensive belt in several places, but progress was agonizingly slow. Instead of the sweeping breakthrough envisioned, the advance resembled a slugging match, with German armor clawing forward a few kilometers at a time. Hausser's 2 SS Panzer Corps spearheaded much of this fighting, driving relentlessly toward Prokhorovka, a small town that would soon become legendary. The SS divisions, hardened by years of combat, showed remarkable cohesion under fire, coordinating tank, artillery, and infantry assaults with precision. Yet even their determination could not erase the reality that every gain was bought at tremendous cost. For the Soviets, the battle in the south was both perilous and promising. They faced the cream of the German army, armed with the latest technology and pressing forward with immense determination. But their defenses were holding longer than expected, and the depth of their fortifications ensured that no single breach could collapse the front. Soviet commanders skillfully deployed reserves to plug gaps, while their artillery maintained constant pressure on advancing units. At night, fresh troops moved up to reinforce positions, ensuring that the line never weakened beyond repair. The southern fighting also highlighted the evolving balance of air power. The Luftwaffe concentrated large numbers of aircraft to support the offensive, and in many sectors they achieved local superiority, hammering Soviet positions with dive-bombing raids. But the Red Air Force responded with increasing effectiveness. Soviet fighters intercepted bombing raids, while Il-2 Sturmovix attacked German columns on the move. Air battles raged daily, with losses mounting on both sides. Unlike in earlier campaigns, The Germans could not assume uncontested skies, and their ability to coordinate large-scale armored thrusts was hampered accordingly. As the first week of fighting in the south drew to a close, the picture was clear. The Germans were advancing, but far more slowly than planned, and at costs they could ill afford. Soviet defenses remained unbroken in depth, and the reserves poised behind the lines awaited their moment. The Germans were moving toward Prokhorovka, but each day's progress came at the price of tanks, men, and precious time. The decisive clash was drawing nearer, and both sides knew that the fields around Prokhorovka would soon witness one of the most concentrated and violent armored battles in history. As the battle in the south intensified after July 7th, the German thrust became increasingly centered on the drive toward Prokhorovka. This small town, little more than a railway junction surrounded by rolling fields and villages, became the focal point of one of the greatest armored concentrations in history. For the German High Command, seizing Prokhorovka offered the chance to finally rupture the Soviet defenses and break into the open terrain beyond. For the Soviets, defending and countering here was nothing less than essential to prevent disaster. Both sides threw their most elite units into the cauldron, transforming the advance into a struggle of endurance. The two SS Panzer Corps spearheaded this advance. Composed of the Leibstandard, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, it represented the elite of Germany's armored forces. Well-equipped, battle-hardened, and deeply indoctrinated, these units were expected to deliver the breakthrough that had eluded other formations. Their Tigers and Panthers pushed forward relentlessly, leading assaults across minefields and through belts of Soviet defenses. Infantry followed close behind, seizing trenches and strongpoints to widen the breach. German commanders believed that if anyone could smash through, it would be Hausser's SS. Yet the Soviets had anticipated this move with extraordinary clarity. Intelligence and reconnaissance had revealed the direction of the German thrust, and Soviet high command positioned their most powerful armored formation, the 5th Guards Tank Army under General Pavel Rotmistrov, in reserve near Prokhorovka. Rotmistrov's army contained hundreds of T-34s, supported by heavy tanks, artillery, and mechanized infantry. It was a hammer waiting to fall at the critical moment. Until then, Soviet rifle divisions and anti-tank units continued to slow the German advance, exacting a toll in time and lives. The fighting along the approaches to Prokhorovka became increasingly savage. Villages such as Teterovino, Yakovlevo, and Kalinin fell into the path of the SS divisions, each defended stubbornly by Soviet troops. Every settlement had been transformed into a miniature fortress filled with mines, machine guns, and barricades. German tanks blasted houses into rubble to root out defenders, while Soviet infantry counterattacked from concealed positions. Smoke and fire turned the countryside into a nightmarish maze where every hedgerow concealed danger. For German soldiers accustomed to faster advances, the resistance was both frustrating and exhausting. One of the defining features of this phase of the battle was the sheer density of mechanized forces concentrated in a relatively small area. Thousands of tanks, self-propelled guns, and armored vehicles moved through narrow corridors, often clashing at close range. The open terrain that promised maneuver instead funneled the fighting into bloody, congested melees. German tank crews, trained for precision and coordination, found themselves engaging multiple Soviet vehicles at once. Soviet crews, often younger and less experienced, relied on mass and aggression, charging forward in waves to overwhelm even the formidable Tigers. Losses on both sides mounted rapidly. By July 10th, the Germans had forced their way through several defensive belts and were closing on Prokhorovka itself. Yet their momentum was faltering. Mechanical breakdowns plagued the Panthers, which had only recently been introduced to combat. Fuel shortages and overextended supply lines strained the advancing formations. Moreover, every kilometer gained meant fresh Soviet defenses waiting ahead. Hausser pressed his men forward, but the clock was ticking. Hitler had delayed the launch of Citadel for months to bring these divisions and their new tanks into action. Now, with Allied forces landing in Sicily on July 9th, the urgency of time pressed heavily on the German high command. For the Soviets, the narrowing German advance created both peril and opportunity. The peril was clear. The Germans were close to breaking into open ground, where their armored superiority might become decisive. The opportunity lay in the fact that the SS divisions had concentrated so heavily in one sector that they could be met head-on by the massed counterattack Rotmistrov had prepared. Stalin himself took a direct interest in these developments, urging his commanders to hold firm until the 5th Guards Tank Army could be unleashed. The defensive effort was thus doubled, with reserves poured in to buy precious hours and days. The role of the air war in the south cannot be overstated. The Luftwaffe concentrated its strength to support the SS advance, with Ju-87 Stukas and FW-190 fighter bombers pounding Soviet defenses. Bridges, trenches, and artillery positions were repeatedly targeted. Yet the Soviets replied in kind, deploying their own aircraft in large numbers. Il-2 Sturmovix, heavily armored and carrying rockets or cannon, roared over the battlefield to strike German tank columns. The result was a constant aerial battle, with both sides losing aircraft but neither achieving decisive dominance. For ground troops, the roar of engines overhead was a constant companion, bringing destruction at unpredictable moments. By July 11th, the SS divisions were poised just outside Prokhorovka, their tanks massed for a final push. Soviet forces had fallen back in good order, preserving their strength for the decisive counterstrike. Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army was moving into position, preparing to meet the Germans in what would become one of the most intense armored clashes in military history. The stage was set for July 12th, a day that would enter the annals of warfare as the Battle of Prokhorovka. The outcome there would decide not only the southern thrust but the fate of the entire Kursk campaign. For now, the German advance stood tantalizingly close to its goal, but dangerously overextended. The SS divisions had proven their fighting power, but their strength was being eroded with every passing day. Soviet defenses, though battered, were unbroken, and their reserves were ready. The southern front had become a vast furnace, consuming men and machines at an unprecedented rate. All eyes turned to Prokhorovka, where the decisive clash loomed, promising to determine the future of the Eastern Front in a single cataclysmic encounter. Chapter 9. The Battle of Prokhorovka, the greatest tank clash. By July 12, 1943, the stage was set for one of the most monumental armored engagements in the history of warfare, the Battle of Prokhorovka. For weeks, both sides had maneuvered, probed, and tested defenses, but this day promised concentrated armored fury. The Germans, spearheaded by Hausser's 2 SS Panzer Corps, sought to break through the final Soviet defensive belts and gain the open terrain beyond, potentially achieving the decisive victory Hitler so desperately desired. Facing them was Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army, a formation built for exactly this kind of confrontation, ready to strike back with everything it had. The clash would be unprecedented in scale, intensity, and consequence. The terrain around Prokhorovka was deceptively suited for large-scale tank battles. Rolling fields interspersed with small villages, forests, and streams provided both avenues for maneuver and natural obstacles that could be exploited defensively. Soviet planners had studied the ground meticulously, positioning anti-tank guns in concealed positions, fortifying villages, and establishing multiple fallback lines. Rotmistrov concentrated his forces in depth, ensuring that any German breakthrough would be met with immediate counteraction. This preparation reflected an evolution in Soviet operational art. The combination of static defenses, mobile reserves, and armored counterstrikes. On the morning of July 12th, the Germans launched their advance in earnest. Tigers and Panthers led the assault, supported by Panzer IVs and mechanized infantry. The initial movements were precise, reflecting the skill of experienced crews and coordinated command. German artillery and air support struck Soviet positions to soften resistance. Yet the Soviets had anticipated the attack with remarkable accuracy. Anti-tank crews waited patiently, concealed in natural depressions and trenches. Mines and field obstacles slowed the armored columns, forcing them into concentrated paths of advance. The first engagements were catastrophic for both sides. Shells, rockets, and machine gun fire tore through infantry and vehicles alike, setting the tone for a day of relentless combat. Rotmistrov's counterattack was swift and audacious. Concentrating hundreds of T-34s in multiple echelons, he directed his formations to strike the flanks and rear of advancing German units. The Soviet tanks, though individually less armored than Tigers or Panthers, relied on speed, maneuverability, and overwhelming numbers. Columns of T-34s surged across open fields, exposing themselves to artillery and air attack, yet pressing relentlessly. Soviet doctrine emphasized massed assaults to negate German firepower, and here it was executed at an unprecedented scale. The roar of engines, the crack of gunfire, and the explosions of detonated armor filled the air, creating a battlefield of almost surreal intensity. The close-quarters combat between tanks was brutal and chaotic. Many engagements occurred at ranges of just a few hundred meters, where speed and audacity could offset armor superiority. T-34 crews would charge Tigers and attempt to disable them by hitting weaker side and rear armor. Some tanks were knocked out by artillery, others by direct hits in the engine or turret. Both sides suffered enormous losses. Wrecked tanks burned on the steppe, and the ground was littered with vehicles that had been overturned, abandoned, or exploded. The scale of destruction was staggering. Historians estimate that hundreds of tanks were engaged in the day's fighting, making it the largest armored clash in history. Infantry played a crucial role amidst this mechanized chaos. Soviet riflemen and machine gun crews occupied villages, hedgerows, and small forests, firing on approaching German armor at close range. Engineers detonated mines under advancing tanks, creating kill zones. German infantry, meanwhile, sought to support their armor, clearing villages and securing supply lines. Yet the density of Soviet resistance often forced them into perilous engagements, slowing progress and increasing casualties. The battle became a whirlwind of interlocking arms, where coordination and initiative were as decisive as firepower. Air support added another layer to the maelstrom. The Luftwaffe, aware of the critical nature of the engagement, concentrated fighter bombers to disrupt Soviet armor and artillery. Stukas and FW-190s attacked columns, attempting to halt the Soviet counterstroke. Soviet aircraft, however, responded aggressively. Il-2 Sturmovik swooped onto German formations, while Yak and Lag fighters intercepted bombers. The skies became a battleground in themselves, adding to the chaos on the ground. Pilots on both sides faced extreme hazards, and losses were heavy, but neither could gain complete control of the AI or WWII midday. The situation had reached a critical juncture. German units had advanced but were exhausted from continuous fighting, mechanical failures, and relentless Soviet resistance. Rotmistrov's tanks, though battered, had closed in on the German flanks, threatening to destabilize their advance. Commanders on both sides recognized that the outcome of the engagement could determine the fate of the entire southern front. Despite the ferocity of combat, no side had yet achieved decisive control. The battlefield had become a maelstrom of tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft, each element interacting in a way that amplified both destruction and tension. The psychological impact of Prokhorovka was immense. German crews, accustomed to rapid advances, were shocked by the scale and ferocity of Soviet resistance. Soviet soldiers, aware they were engaging elite units, gained confidence as the Germans failed to achieve the breakthrough expected. Each destroyed Tiger or Panther became a symbol of resilience, while the survival and maneuvering of T-34 formations demonstrated the growing tactical sophistication of the Red Army. The clash revealed a fundamental truth. At Kursk, the Red Army had learned to absorb, resist, and counterattack in a manner that neutralized the Wehrmacht's previous advantages. By the evening of July 12th, the Battle of Prokhorovka had reached a stalemate. German forces remained forward but were overextended, their armored strength diminished by continuous engagement and mechanical failures. Soviet tanks had inflicted severe losses, and reserves remained ready to continue pressing. The fighting had exhausted both sides, but the broader strategic impact was becoming evident. The Germans would not achieve a swift breakthrough, and the Soviets had demonstrated that even the most elite units could be blunted by depth, preparation, and massed counterattack. Aftermath and strategic implications. The fighting at Prokhorovka left an indelible mark on the Kursk campaign and on the broader strategic landscape of the Eastern Front. By the evening of July 12th, the sheer scale of destruction and the exhaustion of troops on both sides highlighted the intensity of the clash. While the Germans had advanced in certain sectors, their losses, particularly among elite SS divisions, were staggering. Panthers and Tigers lay in ruin across the fields, many burned or disabled by Soviet fire. Mechanized infantry and supporting artillery had suffered heavy casualties, leaving the attacking formations battered and depleted. It was clear to German commanders that the hoped-for decisive breakthrough had not occurred, and the momentum of the offensive had begun to stall. Soviet forces, though also heavily engaged and suffering substantial losses, retained the cohesion of their formations. The 5th Guards Tank Army, despite the intensity of combat, remained a potent fighting force, its remaining tanks poised for follow-up counterattacks. The depth of the Soviet defense, combined with the ability to rotate reserves effectively, had ensured that no single breach could turn into a catastrophic collapse. This represented a profound shift in operational dynamics. The Wehrmacht could no longer assume that numerical superiority or technical prowess alone would guarantee success, especially against prepared Soviet positions. The immediate tactical outcome of Prokhorovka was a draw in terms of territorial gains. While the Germans had advanced in some local areas, they had not captured the key junctions or broken the southern defensive belts. Importantly, their armored strength had been diminished to the point that further offensive operations became riskier. The concentration of losses among elite units, particularly in the 2 SS Panzer Corps, meant that the Germans were now vulnerable to counterattack and had fewer reserves available to exploit any gains. In contrast, the Soviets, having absorbed the blow, were in a position to regroup, re-establish supply lines, and prepare for sustained operations in depth. Strategically, the battle marked a turning point in Operation Citadel. The German High Command had planned for a swift encirclement, relying on rapid advances from both northern and southern pincers to trap Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. Prokhorovka demonstrated that the Soviet defense-in-depth concept was operationally sound. Even against concentrated armored assaults, the Red Army could hold, bleed the enemy, and retain the capacity to counterstrike. With Model's Ninth Army stalled in the north and Hausser's units depleted in the south, the prospects for completing the encirclement faded rapidly. The initiative, once the domain of the Germans, began to shift decisively to the Soviets. The psychological impact of the battle was equally significant. German soldiers, many of whom had expected another blitzkrieg-style success, were confronted with the reality of modern warfare on the Eastern Front. Victories would not come quickly, and the costs of failure were immense. Morale, particularly among units that had suffered heavy tank losses, began to erode, and confidence in the feasibility of Citadel diminished. Soviet troops, by contrast, experienced a surge of confidence. They had withstood the assault of elite formations, demonstrated the effectiveness of their defensive planning, and retained the capacity to conduct follow-on operations. This newfound self-assurance would be critical in the counteroffensives that followed. The aftermath of Prokhorovka also underscored the evolving nature of armored warfare. While German tanks remained technically superior in armor and firepower, the massed use of T-34s, coordinated with artillery, infantry, and reserves, had proven an effective countermeasure. Soviet doctrine emphasized attrition and depth, exploiting numerical advantage and terrain rather than relying solely on technological parity. The engagement illustrated that large-scale tank battles were no longer solely about individual superiority, but about operational integration, coordination, and the ability to sustain combat over time. Casualty estimates from Prokhorovka reveal the immense human cost. Hundreds of tanks were destroyed or disabled, and both sides suffered tens of thousands of killed, wounded, or missing personnel. Villages and farmland were obliterated, leaving a scarred landscape that bore silent witness to the intensity of the clash. Yet despite these losses, the Soviets had achieved a critical strategic objective. They had blunted the German advance, preserved their forces, and maintained the integrity of the southern defenses that in the broader context of the Eastern Front, Prokhorovka signaled the beginning of a shift in momentum. The failure of the German offensive to achieve a decisive breakthrough at Kursk undermined their capacity to dictate operations. The Red Army, having demonstrated both resilience and operational maturity, began to prepare for a series of counteroffensives that would gradually push the Wehrmacht westward. The initiative, previously monopolized by Germany, now resided increasingly with the Soviets, reshaping the strategic calculus for the remainder of 1943 and beyond. Prokhorovka also left a lasting legacy in military history. It became the benchmark for studying large-scale armored engagements, illustrating the importance of combined arms, preparation, and defensive depth. Soviet planners had shown that even against technically superior forces, thoughtful deployment, reserves, and coordinated counterattacks could produce a decisive strategic effect. For the Germans, the battle highlighted the limits of operational reach, the vulnerabilities of concentration, and the critical importance of logistics and maintenance in sustaining armored warfare. By mid-July, the Kursk offensive had already begun to falter. Citadel, once the centerpiece of Hitler's strategy for the summer, faced the reality that the initiative had slipped. The northern and southern pincers had failed to achieve the intended encirclement, and German forces were overextended, exhausted, and vulnerable. The Battle of Prokhorovka, as the largest and most intense engagement of the campaign, had epitomized the turning tide. It was not merely a local clash, but a decisive moment that signaled the transition from German offensive operations to Soviet strategic ascendancy on the Eastern Front. Chapter 10: Operation Citadel collapses. German withdrawal and Soviet counteroffensive. By mid-July 1943, the once promising Operation Citadel had begun to unravel. What had been conceived as a rapid, decisive German offensive aimed at encircling Soviet forces in the Kursk salient had encountered unexpected resilience, meticulous preparation, and strategic depth that the Wehrmacht had underestimated. The northern advance under Model's Ninth Army remained bogged down in grinding attritional combat, while the southern thrust under Hoth and Hausser had been severely blunted at Prokhorovka. German commanders, facing mounting casualties, mechanical failures, and extended supply lines, confronted the stark reality that their plan for encirclement was failing. The pivot now was whether to continue pressing forward or to begin an orderly withdrawal to preserve combat effectiveness. The decision to withdraw did not come easily. Hitler, as ever, had placed enormous ideological and strategic weight on Citadel. To call it off would be, in his mind, a concession, a crack in the illusion of German invincibility. Yet even the most disciplined commanders could not ignore operational reality. Panther and Tiger losses had mounted, supply lines were overstretched, and the infantry formations, exhausted by continuous engagements, were incapable of sustaining a high-tempo advance. The Luftwaffe, previously expected to maintain air superiority, was being challenged more consistently by Soviet fighters and Il-2 Sturmovix. By mid-July, senior staff recognized that to continue the offensive in earnest risked catastrophic attrition without the likelihood of strategic success. German forces prepared to disengage. Soviet commanders seized the initiative. Stavka, the Soviet High Command, recognized that the Germans were overextended and that a transition to the counteroffensive could yield significant gains. Reserves previously held for localized counterattacks, including tank armies and mechanized corps, were now brought forward to press the advantage. The Red Army's doctrine of depth, combined with the attrition inflicted by the defensive operations over the preceding week, meant that German forces were vulnerable to both flanking attacks and frontal pressure. The timing was critical. If the Soviets struck before German withdrawal could be completed, large formations could be encircled, repeating the very pattern the Germans had hoped to impose. The withdrawal itself was a complex, delicate operation. Units in the north and south had to disengage from frontline combat without creating gaps that the Soviets could exploit. German engineers worked tirelessly to lay smoke screens, dismantle or booby-trap fortifications, and clear minefields to protect retreating forces. Artillery and remaining armor covered the withdrawal, engaging Soviet forces where possible to slow pursuit. This operation demanded coordination and discipline at all levels. Any misstep could result in catastrophe, with units caught in encirclement or destroyed by concentrated Soviet firepower. In the northern sector, Model's Ninth Army faced the dual challenge of disengaging while under pressure from persistent Soviet resistance. Panay Rai and surrounding villages had been contested heavily for days, leaving the ground devastated and forces exhausted. The Soviets had recognized the opportunity to exploit any German hesitation and probed constantly, seeking weaknesses in the defensive line. Model's forces, already strained by continuous attrition, conducted a deliberate, step-by-step withdrawal, fighting delaying actions to preserve the integrity of the army. Engineers detonated bridges behind retreating units, while mobile reserves created temporary defensive nodes to slow Soviet advance. Every meter of retreat was contested, a testament to the strategic pressure being applied. In the south, the withdrawal from the Prokhorovka area was equally perilous. The 2 SS Panzer Corps, after suffering immense losses during the massive tank clash, had to extricate itself from forward positions without falling victim to the massed counterattacks of Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army. The Germans relied heavily on rearguard actions, coordinated artillery fire, and Luftwaffe support to suppress Soviet advances. Yet Soviet troops pressed relentlessly, probing weak points and launching counterattacks aimed at capturing abandoned equipment or cutting off retreating columns. The fighting during the withdrawal was intense and chaotic, demonstrating that even retreat could be a brutal contest of arms. Logistics played a decisive role during this period. Fuel and ammunition shortages became increasingly acute as German supply lines were strained over the devastated Kursk terrain. Vehicles and tanks frequently broke down, forcing crews to abandon them under enemy fire. The Soviets, who had anticipated this attritional dynamic, focused on disrupting German supply lines with artillery and airstrikes. By targeting roads, railways, and bridging points, they slowed the German withdrawal, ensuring that the retreat would be costly in both men and material. The very depth of Soviet planning meant that German forces could never simply disengage cleanly. They were forced to fight their way out step by step. For the Soviets, the transition to counteroffensive operations represented both opportunity and risk. Concentrated armored formations, supported by infantry and artillery, were now pressed forward to exploit German vulnerabilities. Yet commanders had to maintain coordination over a wide front, avoid overextension, and ensure that follow-on forces were properly supplied. Stavka's meticulous planning allowed the Red Army to combine pressure with operational prudence. Units that had withstood German attacks were repositioned to strike weak points, while reserves were committed in depth to sustain momentum. The result was a gradual but relentless shift in operational control toward the Soviets by late July. The overall strategic picture was clear. Operation Citadel, the pinnacle of the German summer offensive, had failed to achieve its objectives. The Germans had inflicted significant casualties and temporarily seized some ground, but they had neither broken the Soviet defensive lines nor encircled the Kursk salient. The Soviets, through careful preparation, resilient defense, and timely counterattacks, had preserved their forces while inflicting attritional damage that Germany could scarcely replace. The operational initiative had shifted permanently to the Red Army, setting the stage for the subsequent Soviet summer offensives, which would push the Germans steadily westward. The collapse of Citadel marked a turning point in the Eastern Front. German forces were now largely on the defensive, forced to consolidate positions and rebuild after heavy losses. Soviet confidence surged, bolstered by both tactical and strategic success. The lessons of Kursk, particularly the value of preparation, depth, and coordinated counteroffensives, would guide Soviet operations for the remainder of the war. For the Germans, the battle highlighted the limitations of armored superiority when faced with prepared, disciplined, and deeply layered defenses, changing the operational calculus on the Eastern Front for the remainder of 1943 and beyond. Chapter 11: Soviet Counteroffensives. The drive to Orel and Belgorod. Part 1. Following the failure of Operation Citadel, the strategic momentum on the Eastern Front decisively shifted to the Soviets. With German forces weakened, depleted, and in retreat, the Red Army initiated a series of counteroffensives designed to exploit the operational paralysis of the Wehrmacht. Among the most critical of these operations were the drives toward Orel in the north and Belgorod in the south. These offensives would not only capitalize on the attritional damage inflicted during Kursk, but also serve as a prelude to the liberation of occupied territories and the permanent erosion of German operational initiative in 1943. The Northern Offensive, aimed at recapturing Orel, drew upon units that had endured the defensive struggle during the initial days of Citadel. General Model's Ninth Army had been stalled for weeks, and while still a formidable formation, it had been weakened by attrition, the loss of armor, and disrupted logistics. Stavka exploited this vulnerability by concentrating forces in depth, combining infantry, artillery, and armored formations into a cohesive counterstrike. The strategy relied on pressing the Germans along multiple axes, forcing them into a reactive posture and denying them the time to reorganize effectively. Reconnaissance, intelligence, and local partisan activity all contributed to the accuracy and timing of these operations. The Soviet forces advanced with methodical precision. Initial probing attacks sought to identify weak points and isolate forward German positions. Artillery barges softened defenses, while mechanized corps moved to exploit any breaches. For the Germans, entrenched in hastily prepared defensive positions, the counteroffensive presented a new set of challenges. Infantry and tank units, already stretched thin from the prolonged engagements at Panayrai and the northern Salient, were forced to absorb additional pressure. Supply shortages and the cumulative fatigue of months of combat further reduced the Ninth Army's capacity for effective resistance. Each Soviet advance, even if measured in small gains, carried a psychological weight that compounded operational difficulties. To the south, the offensive toward Belgorod reflected a different operational rhythm, but equally decisive intent. German forces, weakened by the losses at Prokhorovka, were forced to withdraw, abandoning positions that had been gained at such high cost. The Red Army's southern formations, including elements of the Voronezh Front and the 5th Guards Tank Army, pressed forward relentlessly. Soviet commanders leveraged the terrain, combining armored thrusts with infantry sweeps across villages and river crossings. Artillery support, coordinated with aerial reconnaissance, allowed for precise targeting of German strongpoints, while mobile reserves were constantly fed into critical sectors to maintain momentum. The psychological impact on the retreating German units was severe. Units were forced to abandon damaged vehicles, and morale eroded under constant pressure. The fighting along the Belgorod axis highlighted the Red Army's operational sophistication. Unlike earlier in the war, when Soviet offensives often relied on overwhelming numbers without finesse, the counteroffensives after Kursk reflected careful planning and coordination. Infantry, armor, and artillery were integrated to maximize effect, supported by reconnaissance and logistical preparation. Engineers constructed bridges over contested rivers, cleared minefields, and repaired roads to maintain the pace of advance. Air support, both in direct ground attack and in intercepting German sorties, ensured that the retreating Wehrmacht faced constant harassment. The combination of these factors allowed Soviet forces to advance steadily despite the remnants of German resistance. The logistical dimension of the Soviet counteroffensive was equally critical. Months of preparation during the defensive phase of Kursk had ensured that supply lines, fuel depots, and artillery positions were prepositioned to support a rapid transition to attack. As the Red Army pressed forward, railheads and forward depots enabled units to maintain operational tempo. In contrast, German forces were increasingly constrained by disrupted lines of communication and the destruction of key infrastructure during retreat. Trucks and trains struggled to deliver fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements to the front, leaving many units vulnerable to concentrated Soviet attacks. By mid-July, the operational picture was becoming starkly clear. The Germans were in retreat on both northern and southern axes. While localized counterattacks by German units occasionally delayed the Soviet advance, these were insufficient to restore initiative. In the north, Soviet forces methodically closed in on Orel, forcing the Ninth Army to establish successive defensive positions. In the south, the Belgorod advance continued relentlessly, with Soviet formations reclaiming territory and inflicting further attrition on German forces. The strategic consequences of these advances were profound, as the Wehrmacht's ability to conduct offensive operations in the region was effectively nullified. The psychological dimension of the counteroffensive cannot be overstated. Soviet troops, having survived the crucible of Citadel, now fought with renewed confidence and operational knowledge. German soldiers, conversely, were demoralized by their inability to achieve decisive results despite concentrated efforts and elite formations. This shift in morale had tangible effects on combat effectiveness, influencing unit cohesion, decision-making, and willingness to sustain protracted engagements. By combining tactical proficiency with operational initiative, the Soviets were beginning to turn Kursk from a defensive triumph into the opening phase of a broader strategic counteroffensive. By the close of Part 1 of the Soviet counteroffensives, the Red Army had effectively transitioned from defense to sustained operational offense. Orel in the north and Belgorod in the south were no longer distant objectives, but achievable milestones, driving the German forces steadily back. The combination of preparation, depth, and coordinated mechanized and infantry operations ensured that the Germans could not regroup quickly, while Soviet reserves allowed for flexibility and adaptation. The stage was set for continued momentum, signaling that Kursk had not only ended Germany's operational initiative, but had inaugurated a new phase of Soviet strategic ascendancy. As the Soviet counteroffensive pressed forward in late July 1943, the operational outcomes at Orel in the north and Belgorod in the south became increasingly significant, illustrating the cumulative effect of the Battle of Kursk and the subsequent German retreat. The Ninth Army, though still organized and capable of resisting localized assaults, had been significantly weakened during weeks of attritional fighting around Panayrai and adjacent sectors. Exhausted troops, disrupted supply lines, and diminished armored strength meant that German forces were now largely reactive, forced to prioritize survival and preservation over any continuation of offensive initiative. Meanwhile, Soviet forces seized every opportunity to exploit the Wehrmacht's vulnerabilities. In the north, the drive toward Orel was methodical and relentless. Soviet infantry advanced through heavily forested areas, rivers, and villages, systematically reducing pockets of resistance while maintaining coordination with armored formations. Artillery fire was concentrated on likely defensive positions, and air reconnaissance allowed for precision strikes against entrenched German forces. The Ninth Army, retreating under pressure, attempted to establish successive defensive lines. However, each fallback position came under concentrated Soviet attack, and the accumulation of losses in tanks, vehicles, and personnel steadily eroded German capacity to mount a coordinated defense. Every kilometer ceded further emphasized the strategic consequences of the failed Citadel offensive. Belgorod in the south presented similar challenges for the Wehrmacht. German divisions, particularly those of the 2 SS Panzer Corps and 4th Panzer Army remnants, had suffered heavily during the clash at Prokhorovka. Their ability to mount counterattacks was limited by depleted forces and the logistical strain of retreating under constant pressure. Soviet mechanized corps pressed the advantage, often encircling isolated units or forcing surrenders of exhausted troops. The liberation of Belgorod became both a tactical and symbolic objective, representing the reversal of German gains and the emergence of Soviet initiative. Villages along the route, once fiercely defended, fell in succession as Soviet artillery and air support relentlessly weakened the German positions. The scale of German losses during this period was staggering. Equipment abandoned or destroyed during retreat included hundreds of tanks, self-propelled guns, trucks, and artillery pieces. Many of the elite SS divisions that had spearheaded the southern thrust were effectively reduced to fractions of their original strength. Casualties were compounded by the inability to replace experienced crews, particularly tank operators and officers, whose skills were critical to maintaining operational effectiveness. Mechanized infantry units, facing continuous pressure, were forced to consolidate, leaving gaping holes in the German defensive network that the Soviets were quick to exploit. Soviet losses, while significant, were mitigated by operational depth and the careful rotation of units. Frontline formations were reinforced with reserves drawn from secondary lines, ensuring sustained momentum without excessive exhaustion. Artillery, engineers, and air support were integrated to maximize effectiveness and minimize vulnerability to German countermeasures. Soviet logistical planning, including pre-positioned fuel depots, forward supply nodes, and intact rail lines, enabled mechanized corps to maintain offensive tempo. The operational outcome was clear. The Red Army was conducting a counteroffensive with strategic purpose, while the Germans were retreating under duress. By late July, the strategic implications of the Orel and Belgorod advances were becoming apparent. The Kursk salient, once a focus of German ambition, had effectively been neutralized. Soviet forces not only regained lost territory, but also inflicted losses that would take the Germans months to replace. The failure of Operation Citadel and the subsequent counteroffensives marked a decisive shift in operational initiative on the Eastern Front. German commanders, who had planned to dictate the tempo of operations, found themselves responding to Soviet actions, with their strategic choices increasingly constrained by the need to preserve combat power. The psychological dimension of these operations was equally significant. Soviet troops, having absorbed the most intense German attacks at Kursk and participated in successful counteroffensives, gained confidence and operational experience that would inform subsequent campaigns. Morale soared as victories accumulated, and the narrative of Soviet resilience and growing mastery of large-scale operations reinforced both troop motivation and command confidence. German soldiers, conversely, faced not only the tangible losses of men and material, but also the erosion of confidence in their ability to impose decisive outcomes, a stark contrast to the blitzkrieg ethos that had previously defined Wehrmacht operations. The combined effect of the northern and southern counteroffensives solidified Soviet strategic control over the Kursk region. The Wehrmacht's offensive capacity in the salient was effectively neutralized, while Soviet forces were positioned to conduct subsequent operations aimed at pushing German units further west. The tactical gains achieved at Orel and Belgorod were not isolated victories. They represented the operational transition from defense to sustained strategic offense. The cumulative effect of attritional combat during Citadel, followed by methodical counteroffensive pressure, permanently shifted the balance of power in this theater of the Eastern Front. Ultimately, the Soviet drives to Orel and Belgorod demonstrated the transformative impact of the Kursk campaign. Defensive depth, meticulous planning, and operational coordination had allowed the Red Army to absorb a major German offensive, preserve combat strength, and transition effectively to counteroffensive operations. German forces, despite technical superiority and elite units, had been unable to achieve strategic objectives, suffered substantial losses, and were forced into retreat. The operational outcomes not only stabilized the front, but also set the stage for a series of follow-on offensives that would carry Soviet forces steadily westward, signaling a profound shift in the trajectory of the war. Chapter 12: The Aftermath of Kursk, German Strategic Reassessment, and Soviet Momentum. By the end of July 1943, the dust of the Kursk salient had barely begun to settle, yet the consequences of the battle reverberated across the Eastern Front and beyond. Operation Citadel, envisioned as the crowning summer offensive for Germany, had failed to achieve its objectives. The Wehrmacht, despite deploying its most elite armored formations, experienced catastrophic losses in men and material. Tigers and Panthers, previously symbols of invincibility, lay in ruins across the steppes. Mechanized infantry, reduced in number and effectiveness, were unable to consolidate gains or mount significant follow-up attacks. For German strategists, the scale of defeat necessitated immediate reassessment of both operational capabilities and broader strategic plans. The German High Command, in the wake of Citadel, confronted a stark operational reality. Their armored units had been committed at the point of maximum effort, yet they had failed to deliver the decisive encirclement that Hitler demanded. Units that had spearheaded the offensive, particularly Hausser's 2 SS Panzer Corps and Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, were battered, and the logistical strain on fuel, ammunition, and repair facilities was severe. Overextended supply lines, compounded by the attritional losses inflicted by Soviet defenses, meant that the Wehrmacht could no longer assume initiative in this sector. In essence, the operational pendulum had swung irreversibly in favor of the Red Army. Strategically, German planners had to confront the broader implications of Kursk's failure. Previously, German doctrine relied on rapid, high-tempo operations, blitzkrieg, that leveraged armored superiority, concentrated firepower, and surprise to achieve operational encirclement. Kursk exposed the limitations of this approach when facing a deeply fortified, highly mobile, and resilient opponent. The Soviets had transformed the terrain of the salient into a series of interlocking defensive belts, layered with mines, anti-tank positions, artillery, and mechanized reserves. The defensive depth, combined with intelligence-informed positioning and effective use of counterattacks, had nullified the Wehrmacht's offensive doctrine. German commanders recognized that any future offensive would require not only overwhelming force, but also extensive preparation and logistics. And even then, success was far from guaranteed. The human cost to German forces was staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured during the protracted battles of Kursk and its immediate aftermath. Elite SS divisions were operating at fractions of their original strength. Armored units had lost hundreds of vehicles, many irrecoverably. Replacements were scarce, especially for trained tank crews and officers capable of coordinating large-scale, mechanized operations. Morale, previously buoyed by a string of victories on the Eastern Front, now faced a profound psychological shock. The Wehrmacht's aura of invincibility had been shattered, replaced by the recognition that the Red Army could not only resist, but also strike back effectively under conditions of their choosing. Conversely, the Soviets emerged from Kursk with both tactical and strategic momentum. The Red Army had demonstrated mastery over defensive operations, attritional warfare, and the transition to counteroffensive action. Units that had participated in the defensive phases gained invaluable combat experience, particularly in coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support in complex operations. The successful execution of counteroffensives toward Orel and Belgorod showcased the maturation of Soviet operational art, combining careful preparation, depth, and flexibility. Soviet forces now possess the confidence and capability to seize the operational initiative across multiple axes. Stavka, the Soviet High Command, understood the importance of exploiting this momentum. The failure of Citadel had left German forces weakened and overextended, presenting an opportunity to transition from localized counterattacks to sustained strategic offensives. Planning now emphasized the integration of mechanized corps, infantry armies, and artillery concentrations, supported by forward logistics and air superiority efforts. The operational lessons of Kursk were applied meticulously. Reconnaissance was critical, reserves were maintained in depth, and offensive efforts were coordinated to avoid overextension or piecemeal attacks. The resulting momentum allowed the Soviets to dictate the tempo of operations for the remainder of the summer. The wider strategic implications extended beyond immediate frontline operations. Kursk marked the definitive end of German strategic initiative in the East. Before this point, the Wehrmacht had frequently dictated the timing and location of major operations. Afterward, they increasingly reacted to Soviet movements, forced into defensive postures across broad sectors. The psychological impact of this shift on German commanders was profound, influencing decisions in subsequent campaigns, including defensive efforts in Ukraine, the southern sector, and beyond. Kursk underscored that the Red Army had transformed from a resilient, recovering force into a mature, operationally sophisticated adversary capable of seizing and sustaining the initiative. The operational consequences for Germany also included the need for structural reevaluation. Tank production, logistics networks, and training pipelines had to be re-examined in light of catastrophic losses. Units that had been elite in both equipment and experience required extensive rebuilding, while the attrition of officers necessitated rapid promotions, often placing less experienced commanders in critical positions. German industry faced pressures to replace lost armor, yet the delay inherent in producing new Panthers and Tigers meant that operational gaps would persist. Meanwhile, Soviet production of T-34s, combined with tactical doctrine emphasizing massed armored deployment, ensured that German material losses were increasingly difficult to compensate. Simultaneously, the Red Army's confidence manifested in operational expansion. Following the counteroffensives to Orel and Belgorod, Soviet formations began to prepare for more ambitious operations aimed at pushing the Wehrmacht steadily westward. Stavka recognized that the time had come to transition fully from defensive operations to sustained, coordinated offensives designed to reclaim occupied territory and destroy German formations where feasible. The operational lessons of Kursk, resilient defense, depth, massed counterattack, and combined arms integration, would now inform a series of campaigns that gradually shifted the balance of power on the Eastern Front in favor of the Soviets. It'd be why the close of Part 1. The aftermath of Kursk was unmistakably clear. German forces were forced into operational retrenchment, struggling to replace losses, maintain cohesion, and reorganize depleted units. The Red Army, conversely, had demonstrated its capacity to absorb devastating attacks, inflict attritional damage, and transition seamlessly to strategic counteroffensives. Kursk had thus not only been a defensive triumph, but also the fulcrum upon which the momentum of the Eastern Front pivoted irreversibly toward the Soviets, setting the stage for the campaigns that would follow in late 1943 and 1944. In the weeks following the conclusion of Operation Citadel, Soviet forces wasted no time in exploiting the operational and psychological advantage gained at Kursk. The German retreat, while orderly in parts, left gaps in their defensive network that were rapidly exploited by mechanized formations and infantry armies advancing in coordination. The Red Army's operational planners emphasized continuity, ensuring that advances were reinforced and consolidated rather than fleeting probes. This careful application of pressure highlighted the growing sophistication of Soviet strategy, the ability to maintain offensive momentum over weeks, combining tactical victories into decisive operational outcomes. The drive from Kursk toward Orel and Belgorod represented the first stage of this exploitation. Soviet armored units, supported by artillery concentrations and forward air support, advanced systematically along the northern and southern axes. German units, depleted and dispersed, could only offer intermittent resistance. Where opposition stiffened, Soviet engineers constructed temporary bridges and cleared minefields under fire, maintaining operational tempo. The pace of advance, although slower than a mechanized blitz, was relentless, ensuring that German forces were constantly reacting rather than initiating. Over time, this cumulative pressure created a widening operational gap between frontline units and reserves, further compromising German cohesion. German strategic reassessment intensified as Soviet operations unfolded. High Command, confronted with the failure of Citadel and the subsequent loss of initiative, faced difficult decisions regarding reinforcement priorities, unit withdrawals, and defensive deployments. The need to plug gaps created by Soviet advances forced redistribution of elite formations, such as the remnants of the SS Panzer divisions, often creating further vulnerabilities elsewhere along the front. The inability to rapidly replace destroyed or damaged equipment compounded the operational strain. Consequently, German commanders increasingly focused on defensive consolidation rather than ambitious operational maneuvers, conceding strategic initiative to the Red Army. The operational gains of the Soviets were not solely territorial, but also psychological. The repeated successes in driving German units from fortified positions reinforced confidence among both commanders and troops. Units that had endured the fiercest elements of Operation Citadel emerged battle-hardened and experienced in executing large-scale combined arms operations. Their capacity to integrate infantry, armor, artillery, and air support had evolved significantly since earlier campaigns, demonstrating that Soviet operational art had matured to a level capable of sustained strategic impact. This operational maturity transformed victories at Orel and Belgorod into more than tactical successes. They became harbingers of broader shifts on the Eastern Front. Logistics remained a decisive factor in sustaining these gains. Soviet planners had meticulously prepared supply chains, forward depots, and transportation networks to maintain the advance. Rail lines captured intact or rapidly repaired were used to funnel reinforcements, ammunition, and fuel directly to advancing formations. Mechanized units could press the attack without the debilitating pauses that had historically slowed offensive operations, maintaining pressure on retreating German forces. By contrast, the Wehrmacht struggled to maintain operational cohesion, constrained by damaged infrastructure, disrupted supply lines, and the cumulative toll of weeks of attritional combat. The German response, although methodical, was hampered by these constraints. Defensive positions, hastily constructed or reinforced during retreat, offered temporary respite but could not absorb the sustained Soviet offensive indefinitely. Artillery emplacements, minefields, and remaining armor were deployed to delay and attrit advancing forces, yet the overall effect was limited. Soviet units bypassed or overcame these obstacles through maneuver, coordination, and combined arms tactics. The operational consequence was that German forces increasingly ceded the initiative, forced to adopt a reactive stance that constrained their strategic options and dictated the pace and location of engagements. By August, Soviet forces had regained substantial territory along the northern and southern axes of the Kursk salient. The liberation of Belgorod and the consolidation of positions near Orel marked tangible operational milestones that reflected both tactical skill and strategic foresight. The Red Army's ability to conduct these operations while maintaining cohesion and momentum demonstrated a level of operational proficiency previously unseen at this scale. These advances not only recovered territory lost earlier in the war, but also positioned Soviet forces favorably for subsequent operations in Ukraine and along the Dnieper River, where the lessons of Kursk would continue to influence planning and execution. The repercussions for German forces extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Losses in men, vehicles, and material from Citadel and the subsequent counteroffensives meant that Germany's capacity for future large-scale operations in the Eastern Front was significantly impaired. Elite formations were weakened, command structures strained, and operational flexibility reduced. The Wehrmacht could no longer dictate the tempo of operations. Instead, it faced the prospect of conducting a series of defensive engagements against a numerically and operationally resurgent adversary. Strategically, Kursk and the Soviet exploitation of its momentum represented a watershed moment, signaling the beginning of a sustained shift in favor of the Red Army. Equally significant was the psychological effect of these developments on German and Soviet forces alike. The Wehrmacht, accustomed to dictating outcomes on the Eastern Front through superior training, equipment, and operational initiative, was forced into a posture of constant response. Morale, previously buoyed by successive victories and perceived tactical invincibility, suffered a substantial blow. Soviet forces, in contrast, drew confidence from both the tactical and operational successes, recognizing their capacity to plan, execute, and sustain complex operations over a prolonged period. This newfound operational confidence would be a key factor in the series of offensives that followed, gradually eroding German positions further across the Eastern Front. By the end of Part 2, it was clear that the aftermath of Kursk had solidified the strategic advantage of the Soviets. German forces were forced into defensive retrenchment, their operational initiative lost, while the Red Army had not only absorbed the German offensive, but transformed it into a springboard for sustained operations. The momentum gained through counteroffensives toward Orel and Belgorod set the stage for continued strategic advances, illustrating that Kursk was more than a defensive triumph. It was the pivotal turning point that shifted the Eastern Front decisively in favor of the Soviet Union. Chapter 13: Casualties, Losses, and Lessons of the Battle of Kursk. The Battle of Kursk, fought between July and August 1943, stands as one of the largest, most complex, and bloodiest engagements of the Second World War. Both sides incurred staggering losses, reflecting the intensity of combat and the scale of the forces involved. For historians and military analysts, understanding the casualties, equipment losses, and operational lessons of Kursk is essential, not only for comprehending the campaign itself, but also for grasping the transformation of warfare on the Eastern Front. The battle produced profound insights into armored warfare, defensive preparation, operational planning, and the interplay of human, technological, and logistical factors in modern combat. German casualties during the Kursk offensive were substantial. Estimates vary depending on sources and the definition of casualties, but it is generally accepted that the Wehrmacht suffered between 50,000 to 60,000 killed or missing and over 150,000 wounded during the entirety of Citadel and the subsequent retreat. Elite formations, such as the SS Panzer divisions and experienced panzer crews, bore a disproportionate share of losses. The destruction of these units had operational and psychological consequences. The German army not only lost seasoned personnel, but also diminished its capacity to conduct high-tempo armored operations in subsequent months. Each lost crew represented a combination of tactical expertise, experience, and leadership that could not be replaced quickly. Soviet losses were also staggering, though somewhat more distributed across multiple fronts and formations. Estimates suggest that the Red Army suffered between 70,000 and 80,000 killed and over 150,000 wounded. Additionally, tens of thousands were reported missing, often taken prisoner during localized German breakthroughs or lost in the chaos of mechanized engagements. Despite these heavy losses, Soviet forces retained operational integrity, largely due to the depth of their reserves, redundancy in command structures, and prepositioning of forces in depth. The Red Army's ability to absorb enormous casualties while maintaining cohesion was a defining feature of its operational success at Kursk. Equipment losses provide an equally dramatic picture of the battle's intensity. German armored forces lost several hundred tanks and assault guns, including a significant proportion of Tigers, Panthers, and Panzer IVs. Many of these losses resulted from concentrated Soviet anti-tank defenses, attrition, mechanical breakdowns, or air attacks. The intensity of combat and prolonged operational tempo often forced the Germans to abandon vehicles that might have been reparable under less chaotic circumstances. The depletion of armored strength was especially critical for the Wehrmacht, as the combination of lost vehicles and trained crews significantly constrained operational flexibility for the remainder of 1943 that the Red Army, while numerically superior, also incurred major equipment losses. Hundreds of T-34 tanks were destroyed or disabled in the fierce engagements at Prokhorovka, Panayri, and other sectors. Mechanized corps suffered from wear and tear, battlefield damage, and attrition under German fire. Yet the Soviet production system, emphasizing mass production and rapid replacement, allowed damaged units to be repaired and reinforcements deployed more rapidly than Germany could replace losses. This industrial advantage, combined with operational depth and effective logistics, ensured that the Red Army could sustain momentum despite substantial material attrition, a crucial factor in the counteroffensives toward Orel and Belgorod. The human and material costs were compounded by the extreme intensity of combined arms combat. Kursk was not merely a series of isolated engagements, but a vast, interconnected theater where infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and aircraft interacted continuously. Close-quarter combat, artillery bombardments, tank-on-tank clashes, and air-ground operations created an environment of constant danger and high attrition. Soldiers on both sides faced harrowing conditions, from the scorching heat of the Russian summer to the psychological strain of facing continuous, overwhelming firepower. Casualty figures alone cannot fully convey the intensity of the human experience on the battlefield. Operational lessons from Kursk had profound implications for both German and Soviet forces. For the Germans, the battle exposed the vulnerabilities of concentrated armored thrusts against deeply prepared defenses. Despite technical superiority in tanks like the Tiger and Panther, operational effectiveness was limited when facing well-entrenched positions, coordinated anti-tank fire, and mass counterattacks. Mechanized warfare required not only superior technology, but also secure flanks, effective logistics, and flexibility, factors often constrained by overextension and attritional pressures. The failure of Citadel highlighted that even elite forces could not achieve strategic breakthroughs without exhaustive preparation and coordination across multiple arms of service. Soviet operational lessons were equally significant. The success at Kursk reinforced the value of defense in depth, massed counterattacks, and the integration of infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. The Red Army demonstrated that numerical superiority, when combined with tactical coordination, logistical foresight, and careful use of reserves, could neutralize technological advantages. The engagement also emphasized the importance of intelligence and reconnaissance. Knowing the timing, disposition, and intentions of the enemy allowed the Soviets to allocate resources effectively and avoid catastrophic surprises. These lessons informed subsequent operations, particularly the summer and autumn offensives in 1943, setting the foundation for sustained operational success. The broader implications of Kursk extended beyond immediate losses. The battle marked a turning point on the Eastern Front. For Germany, it was the last major offensive where the Wehrmacht could dictate the terms of engagement. For the Soviets, it was the point where operational initiative shifted decisively in their favor. The attrition inflicted during Citadel, combined with the subsequent counteroffensives, ensured that German forces would increasingly react rather than act, constrained by diminished resources and mounting pressure across multiple sectors. The transformation in operational momentum had long-term consequences, shaping the trajectory of the war in Eastern Europe for the next year and beyond. By the conclusion of Part 1, it was clear that Kursk had been not just a massive battle, but a crucible that revealed both the limitations and strengths of modern mechanized warfare. The staggering casualties, material losses, and operational complexity highlighted the human and technological cost of armored engagements at this scale. Yet the Red Army's resilience, capacity for adaptation, and mastery of operational depth ensured that these costs translated into strategic advantage rather than defeat. For the Germans, the failure to achieve decisive results despite elite formations and advanced equipment underscored the strategic challenge they now faced, reversing the tide against an increasingly confident, experienced, and industrially supported opponent. The Battle of Kursk, while primarily a tactical and operational contest, also offered far-reaching strategic and doctrinal lessons that influenced both German and Soviet planning for the remainder of World War II. Beyond the immediate human and material costs, the engagement provided a template for understanding the limitations and potentials of armored warfare, combined arms operations, and large-scale operational planning. Both sides, through the crucible of combat, extracted insights that would shape the Eastern Front in the months and years that followed. From a German perspective, Kursk exposed fundamental vulnerabilities in the Wehrmacht's approach to offensive operations. While German tanks, such as the Panther and Tiger, represented technical superiority in armor and firepower, the operational effectiveness of these formations was compromised when facing well-prepared defenses in depth. Massed minefields, anti-tank ditches, artillery concentrations, and coordinated infantry armor defenses negated much of the advantage of superior engineering. The concentrated losses suffered by the elite SS panzer divisions revealed that technical prowess could not substitute for operational security, adequate reserves, or sustained logistical support. Overextension, attrition, and the inability to achieve a decisive breakthrough became central lessons for German planners. Logistics emerged as a critical factor that could no longer be subordinated to doctrinal assumptions. German supply lines, already stretched across the vast Kursk salient, were further disrupted by Soviet resistance, air attacks, and the deliberate destruction of infrastructure during retreat. Fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts were finite, and the loss of mechanized units had cascading effects on operational flexibility. Future planning had to contend with the harsh reality that even the most advanced weapon systems are only as effective as the logistics and infrastructure supporting them. Kursk demonstrated that operational ambition without logistical grounding could be fatal, a lesson that resonated in later campaigns across Ukraine and the Eastern Front. The Soviets, conversely, reinforced and refined the principles of defense in depth and operational coordination. Kursk proved that a numerically superior, well-prepared, and flexible force could absorb and repel technically superior opponents while conserving combat power for decisive counterattacks. The integration of artillery, armor, infantry, and air support into coherent operational plans was particularly instructive. The Red Army learned to balance attrition and maneuver, coordinating mechanized corps with infantry armies in a manner that maximized the impact of limited resources while minimizing vulnerability to enemy strikes. This doctrinal maturation provided a foundation for subsequent operations, including the liberation of Ukraine and the massive offensives of 1944. Intelligence and reconnaissance were other critical lessons derived from Kursk. The Soviets, benefiting from foreknowledge of German plans through intercepts, partisan reports, and local observation, were able to allocate forces, construct defenses, and coordinate reserves with remarkable precision. Accurate intelligence allowed the Red Army to anticipate enemy movements, prepare defensive belts, and plan effective counteroffensives. For the Germans, the failure to achieve operational surprise, once a hallmark of blitzkrieg, highlighted the growing sophistication of Soviet operational security and intelligence. Both sides learned that knowledge of the battlefield environment, enemy dispositions, and operational intentions could decisively influence outcomes. Armored warfare, the centerpiece of Kursk, revealed profound insights into the interaction of technology, terrain, and doctrine. The massive tank engagements, particularly at Prokhorovka, illustrated that numerical superiority, tactical coordination, and combined arms integration often outweighed individual technological advantages. German tanks, formidable in individual performance, could be neutralized by concentrated anti-tank defenses, terrain constraints, and coordinated infantry-artillery action. Conversely, the Soviet use of massed T-34 formations, integrated with supporting arms and guided by intelligence, showcased the effectiveness of operational synergy over individual technological advantage. This lesson would influence armored doctrine across both the Eastern and Western fronts in the years to follow. Psychological and morale factors also proved decisive. Kursk demonstrated that operational success is not solely measured by territory gained or enemy losses inflicted, but also by the impact on troop confidence and initiative. German forces, despite initial momentum and technical superiority, suffered morale setbacks as they confronted a resilient and well-coordinated adversary. Conversely, Soviet soldiers, emboldened by successful defense and the transition to counteroffensive operations, gained confidence in both leadership and operational capacity. This psychological dimension of warfare underscored the importance of cohesion, training, and the ability to sustain operational pressure over extended periods. Strategically, Kursk marked a turning point on the Eastern Front. German forces would no longer dictate the tempo of operations, shifting from offensive ambition to defensive necessity. Soviet forces, having demonstrated both operational resilience and tactical mastery, assumed the initiative, guiding subsequent campaigns with growing confidence. The lessons learned from Kursk about attrition, depth, coordination, and combined arms operations would inform strategic planning for months, contributing to the liberation of occupied territories and the gradual push westward that would culminate in the eventual collapse of German forces in 1945. In the broader scope of military history, Kursk remains a case study in operational art. The effective integration of technology and human factors, and the interplay of preparation and adaptability. Both sides emerged with lessons, but it was the Red Army that translated these lessons into sustained operational advantage. The battle's legacy, from tactical considerations of armored combat to strategic understandings of initiative and attrition, has influenced military thought for decades. Its impact extends beyond the battlefield, shaping doctrines, operational planning, and the study of large-scale mechanized warfare in both historical and contemporary contexts. That'll be why the end of Part 2. It is clear that Kursk was more than a battle. It was a crucible of operational evolution. The staggering casualties and losses underscored the human cost, while the lessons learned reshaped doctrine, strategy, and operational thinking on both sides. The Red Army's ability to convert defensive success into strategic initiative, combined with the German failure to achieve decisive operational results, ensured that Kursk would remain a pivotal moment in the Second World War. Its influence, both immediate and long-term, demonstrates the profound interconnectedness of tactical engagements, operational planning, and strategic outcomes in modern warfare. Chapter 14: Kursk's Legacy. Influence on Eastern Front Campaigns and Modern Military Doctrine. The Battle of Kursk left a profound and lasting legacy on the Eastern Front, shaping subsequent campaigns and informing broader military doctrine in ways that transcended the immediate context of 1943. Its scale, intensity, and operational complexity provided invaluable lessons in both the conduct of large-scale mechanized warfare and the strategic integration of human, technological, and logistical factors. The repercussions of Kursk were felt not only in subsequent Soviet offensives and German defensive operations, but also in the evolution of military thought and doctrine, both during and after World War II. From the perspective of the Eastern Front, Kursk represented a pivotal turning point. The failure of Operation Citadel marked the end of German strategic initiative in this theater. Despite the Wehrmacht's technological advantages in tanks and armored vehicles, and despite the presence of elite divisions, the Germans were unable to achieve the operational encirclement that had been central to their offensive doctrine. Instead, the Red Army, through disciplined defense, operational depth, and coordinated counterattacks, seized the initiative. The momentum gained during the counteroffensives toward Orel and Belgorod allowed Soviet forces to dictate the pace, location, and nature of subsequent operations, fundamentally altering the operational dynamics of the Eastern Front. The immediate aftermath of Kursk influenced campaigns throughout the summer and autumn of 1943. Soviet forces, emboldened by their success, embarked on operations to recapture occupied territories and press the retreating German armies further west. The lessons of defense in depth, coordinated reserves, and mechanized counterattack were applied in campaigns across Ukraine and along the Dnieper River. German defensive strategies were forced to evolve rapidly as commanders sought to consolidate positions, manage depleted armored formations, and maintain operational cohesion in the face of increasingly sophisticated Soviet offensive planning. Kursk thus reshaped the operational landscape of the Eastern Front, ensuring that future engagements would be fought on terms increasingly favorable to the Red Army. Beyond immediate campaigns, Kursk had a lasting influence on the evolution of modern military doctrine. For the Germans, it underscored the limitations of concentrated armored offensives against prepared defenses, emphasizing the need for secure flanks, sustained logistics, and contingency planning. The failure to achieve decisive results despite superior technology highlighted that effective warfare required not only material superiority, but also operational flexibility, intelligence integration, and tactical coordination. These lessons informed German defensive planning for the remainder of the war, even as resources dwindled and the strategic situation deteriorated. The Soviet application of lessons learned at Kursk also had long-term doctrinal consequences. The Red Army's ability to integrate infantry, armor, artillery, and air support into coordinated operational plans demonstrated a level of operational maturity previously unseen in earlier campaigns. The battle validated the use of defense in depth as both a delaying mechanism and a platform for launching decisive counteroffensives. Soviet operational thought began to emphasize the importance of intelligence, reconnaissance, and forward planning, as well as the effective use of reserves to exploit enemy weaknesses. These principles would guide the planning and execution of massive offensives in 1944, including the liberation of Ukraine and the eventual push into Eastern Europe. Kursk also offered critical insights into armored warfare and combined arms tactics. The massed tank engagements, particularly at Prokhorovka, illustrated both the potential and limitations of mechanized formations. German tanks, despite their individual firepower and armor, were neutralized when confronted with prepared defenses, concentrated anti-tank fire, and coordinated infantry-artillery support. Soviet tanks, when used in massed formations and integrated with supporting arms, demonstrated that operational synergy could compensate for technological inferiority in individual platforms. This lesson has echoed through military thought, influencing armored doctrine in both the mid-20th century and modern mechanized warfare. The human dimension of Kursk also informed military doctrine and operational planning. The battle emphasized the importance of morale, training, and experience. German units, despite elite status, suffered from psychological strain and fatigue, undermining combat effectiveness as operations prolonged. Conversely, Soviet soldiers, tested in prolonged defensive and offensive operations, gained operational confidence, adaptability, and cohesion. The integration of these human factors into operational planning, understanding how morale, resilience, and training influence battlefield performance, became increasingly central to military thought in the latter stages of World War II and beyond. Logistical considerations, highlighted starkly by the battle, became a key component of doctrine. The German reliance on extended supply lines, coupled with attrition and infrastructure disruption, underscored the vulnerability of offensive operations lacking secure and flexible logistics. The Soviets, with meticulously prepared supply chains and forward depots, maintained operational tempo and sustained counteroffensives despite heavy losses. The interplay of logistics, operational depth, and mobility at Kursk became a model for understanding how supply chains and resource management directly influence battlefield outcomes in large-scale operations. Kursk's influence extended into post-war military analysis and doctrine development. Scholars and strategists studied the battle as an exemplar of the transition from tactical engagements to operational art. How integrated planning, intelligence, reserves, and combined arms operations determine outcomes in large-scale, mechanized warfare. The engagement became a case study in balancing technology, human factors, and logistics, demonstrating that success on the battlefield requires more than superior firepower or numbers. It requires operational cohesion, adaptability, and strategic foresight. To be why the end of Part 1. It was clear that Kursk's legacy went far beyond its immediate operational results. It shaped subsequent Eastern Front campaigns, influenced German and Soviet doctrine, and provided enduring lessons for modern military planning. The battle's combination of tactical complexity, operational depth, and strategic consequence ensured that it remained a pivotal reference point for understanding both the conduct of World War II and the evolution of mechanized warfare. Kursk was more than a victory or defeat. It was a crucible in which the principles of modern operational art were tested, refined, and validated. The long-term impact of the Battle of Kursk extends far beyond the immediate tactical, operational, and strategic outcomes of the summer of 1943. While the battle itself was a culmination of months of preparation, intelligence gathering, and operational maneuvering, its lessons and consequences reverberated across the Eastern Front for the remainder of World War II and shaped the understanding of mechanized warfare for decades afterward. Kursk marked a decisive pivot point, demonstrating how preparation, coordination, and operational depth could decisively influence the course of a massive, mechanized conflict on the Eastern Front. Kursk cemented a shift in initiative that would define the remainder of the conflict. The Wehrmacht, after suffering catastrophic losses in men and armor, found itself increasingly constrained to defensive operations. Elite divisions, depleted in both personnel and equipment, were forced to adopt reactionary strategies rather than dictate the tempo of campaigns. German commanders, previously confident in their ability to exploit breakthroughs through mobile warfare, faced the sobering reality that Soviet forces could absorb attritional pressure and respond with coordinated counteroffensives. This loss of operational initiative fundamentally altered German planning and required a re-evaluation of objectives, particularly in Ukraine, where subsequent Soviet offensives would drive German forces steadily westward. Soviet forces, on the other hand, emerged with both tactical confidence and strategic momentum. The Red Army had demonstrated its capacity not only to withstand a concentrated German assault, but also to convert defense into decisive counteroffensive operations. The ability to maintain operational cohesion despite heavy casualties, combined with effective coordination across multiple arms, allowed the Soviets to dictate engagements in subsequent campaigns. The victories at Orel and Belgorod, achieved during the immediate aftermath of Kursk, showcased the practical application of lessons learned in defensive and offensive operations, providing a template for future large-scale operations, including the Dnieper, Carpathian Offensive, and the advance into Eastern Europe. Beyond the operational and strategic realms, Kursk also provided enduring insights into the conduct of modern warfare. The battle underscored the importance of combined arms integration, demonstrating that the synergy between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support could compensate for individual technological or numerical limitations. Soviet use of reserves and depth illustrated how layered defensive preparations could absorb the shock of elite mechanized units, turning an initially reactive position into a platform for strategic counteroffensives. Conversely, German experiences highlighted the limitations of relying solely on technological superiority, elite formations, and rapid maneuvers in the absence of operational flexibility and secure logistics. The lessons drawn from Kursk influenced post-war doctrines emphasizing operational depth, integrated arms, and the critical interplay between technology, human factors, and logistics that Kursk's influence extended to armored warfare theory. The massive tank engagements, particularly at Prokhorovka, revealed that numerical and operational coordination could often outweigh individual tank superiority. The German reliance on heavily armored Tigers and Panthers, while formidable in direct confrontation, could be neutralized through well-prepared defensive positions, concentrated anti-tank fire, and coordinated infantry-artillery maneuvers. Soviet mass T-34 formations, integrated with artillery and air support, demonstrated that maneuver, operational depth, and coordination could achieve results disproportionate to technological capability. These insights would shape both Cold War armored doctrine and modern mechanized tactics, emphasizing the importance of combined arms operations and operational flexibility. The psychological and morale dimensions of Kursk also left a lasting imprint on military thought. German forces, despite elite status and technical superiority, were demoralized by the inability to achieve decisive results and by the staggering losses in men and equipment. Soviet forces, conversely, gained confidence and operational maturity, demonstrating the capacity to plan, coordinate, and execute large-scale maneuvers under intense pressure. These factors emphasize that morale, cohesion, and operational experience are critical determinants of success in modern warfare, capable of influencing outcomes even when material and numerical factors are contested. Logistics emerged as another enduring lesson. Kursk highlighted the operational consequences of supply disruptions and the importance of infrastructure, reserves, and forward positioning in sustaining momentum. The German inability to maintain supply lines, combined with the attrition of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, limited their operational options and contributed to the ultimate failure of Citadel. In contrast, the Red Army's meticulous planning, prepositioning of resources, and capacity to reinforce advancing formations ensured that momentum could be maintained. Modern military doctrine has consistently integrated these insights, emphasizing that sustained offensive operations are as dependent on logistics and planning as on combat capability. Strategically, Kursk also informed the broader trajectory of the Eastern Front. The Red Army's growing operational mastery allowed for a series of offensives that liberated vast swaths of Soviet territory, pushed German forces back across multiple fronts, and ultimately contributed to the collapse of the Wehrmacht in Eastern Europe. The shift in initiative demonstrated that operational success could directly translate into strategic advantage, with tactical and operational lessons amplified across successive campaigns. Kursk thus represents not only a pivotal moment in 1943, but also a foundation for the eventual strategic victories that led to the end of the war in Europe. To eye in the long-term view, Kursk has become a central study in modern military thought and operational planning. Its lessons regarding the integration of combined arms operations, the critical role of logistics, the value of intelligence and reconnaissance, and the psychological dimensions of combat continue to influence both historical analysis and contemporary doctrine. The battle demonstrated that operational initiative, preparation, and the ability to convert defensive success into strategic advantage are decisive factors in large-scale mechanized warfare. Kursk's enduring legacy lies in its demonstration that warfare is not merely a contest of numbers or technology, but a multidimensional challenge encompassing planning, coordination, morale, and adaptability. By the conclusion of Part 2, it is evident that the Battle of Kursk was more than a moment in time. It was a crucible of operational art, a turning point that reshaped the Eastern Front, and a source of enduring lessons for military doctrine. The staggering human and material costs were matched by strategic and operational dividends for the Soviets, and the battle's influence continues to inform the understanding of mechanized warfare, combined arms operations, and the complex interplay between tactical execution and strategic outcomes. Kursk's legacy is both immediate and timeless, a defining engagement that continues to shape military thought decades after the guns fell silent. Chapter 15. The Battle of Kursk in Historical Memory and Global Perspective. Part 1. The Battle of Kursk occupies a unique place in the historical memory of World War II, symbolizing not only the ferocity of the Eastern Front, but also the transformative impact of large-scale mechanized warfare. It is remembered as a crucible where both human endurance and technological innovation were tested under extreme conditions. Unlike earlier battles that emphasized rapid maneuver or opportunistic engagements, Kursk represented the apex of coordinated planning, operational depth, and combined arms integration. The engagement has been studied extensively, both in military academies and popular historical literature, as a defining moment that shaped the course of the war and influenced subsequent military thought worldwide. From a Russian perspective, Kursk carries a profound symbolic resonance. It is often portrayed as a testament to Soviet resilience, strategic foresight, and the capacity to absorb and ultimately overcome a technologically advanced, experienced enemy. The meticulous preparation of defensive belts, the use of intelligence to anticipate German plans, and the effective coordination of mechanized and infantry forces illustrate the operational sophistication of the Red Army at this stage of the war. In post-war Soviet historiography, Kursk was celebrated not merely as a tactical victory, but as a strategic turning point that affirmed the strength and capability of Soviet forces to dictate operations across the Eastern Front. Monuments, museums, and commemorative events continue to honor the sacrifice and achievements of the soldiers who fought in the battle, ensuring that Kursk occupies a central place in national memory. In Germany, Kursk is remembered with a mixture of reflection and recognition of its operational consequences. The failure of Operation Citadel highlighted both the limits of German strategic initiative and the vulnerabilities of overextended offensives against well-prepared defenses. German military historians and analysts have studied Kursk extensively, not only for the analysis of armored engagements, but also for understanding operational planning, logistics, and command decision-making under conditions of attrition and pressure. The lessons extracted from Kursk influenced German defensive planning for the remainder of the war, emphasizing the importance of coordination, the management of reserves, and the limitations imposed by material and logistical constraints. The global perspective on Kursk also reflects its significance as a turning point in modern warfare. Military strategists worldwide have studied the battle as an exemplar of large-scale mechanized operations, highlighting how intelligence, preparation, and operational depth can determine outcomes even against elite, technologically superior forces. The integration of tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support demonstrated the evolution of combined arms doctrine, while the scale of the engagement underscored the challenges of sustaining combat operations across vast theaters with extended supply lines. Kursk is often cited in military education as a case study in operational art, illustrating how doctrine, preparation, and adaptability can transform defense into decisive strategic advantage. Kursk's influence on subsequent military thought is particularly notable in the context of armored warfare. The engagement underscored that success in mechanized combat relies not solely on individual equipment superiority, but on coordination, logistics, and the integration of multiple combat arms. The German reliance on Tigers and Panthers, while providing formidable firepower, could not achieve decisive results without operational support and secure supply lines. The Soviet approach, emphasizing mass deployment, maneuver, and support integration, demonstrated that effective operational design could outweigh technological differences. These lessons informed post-war armored doctrine in both NATO and Warsaw Pact forces, influencing tank design, mechanized infantry integration, and operational planning in large-scale conflicts. Historical memory also preserves the human dimension of Kursk, highlighting the extraordinary endurance, bravery, and suffering of soldiers on both sides. The intense combat, combined with harsh environmental conditions, created an environment of extreme psychological and physical stress. Infantry, tank crews, engineers, and airmen faced relentless pressure, often under conditions of fire, smoke, and chaos. Both Soviet and German troops endured staggering casualties, yet the capacity to maintain cohesion and operational effectiveness under such circumstances has become a central point of reflection in historical studies. This human dimension ensures that Kursk is remembered not only as a battle of strategy and equipment, but also as a profound human experience, testing courage, resilience, and adaptation on a scale rarely seen in history. Kursk's historical significance is also reflected in its role as a benchmark for evaluating operational art. Analysts consider it a turning point where operational level planning, intelligence application, and combined arms integration achieved unprecedented levels of complexity. The transition from defensive depth to strategic counteroffensive, the coordination of multiple fronts, and the integration of mechanized and infantry units exemplify principles that continue to inform contemporary military education. Its scale and complexity provide a lens through which historians and military theorists examine the evolution of large-scale warfare, the interplay between technology and human factors, and the strategic consequences of operational decisions. By the conclusion of Part 1, Kursk emerges as a multifaceted historical landmark. It is simultaneously a symbol of Soviet resilience, a cautionary tale of operational overreach, and a crucible for modern military thought. Its legacy encompasses tactical, operational, strategic, and human dimensions, offering enduring lessons for military planners, historians, and students of warfare. The battle's enduring prominence in historical memory underscores the scale, significance, and complexity of the conflict, ensuring that Kursk remains a defining reference point in the study of World War II and mechanized warfare. The global legacy of the Battle of Kursk extends far beyond the Eastern Front, influencing military doctrine, strategic planning, and the study of mechanized warfare worldwide. Its lessons continue to resonate, offering insight into the integration of technology, human factors, logistics, and operational art in large-scale conflicts. Scholars, military strategists, and defense institutions have examined Kursk not only as a historical engagement, but also as a case study in the evolution of modern warfare, emphasizing the interplay between preparation, initiative, and adaptability. One of the most significant lessons of Kursk lies in the application of operational art. The engagement demonstrated that the coordination of multiple combat arms across a wide theater can decisively influence outcomes. Soviet forces, through meticulous planning, intelligence gathering, and defensive preparation, transformed a potentially catastrophic engagement into a platform for operational and strategic advantage. Infantry, armor, artillery, and air forces were integrated with precision, allowing the Red Army to absorb the German offensive, inflict massive attrition, and transition seamlessly to counteroffensive operations. This operational sophistication exemplifies principles that continue to inform modern military planning. The integration of capabilities, depth of preparation, and the decisive use of reserves. Armored warfare theory has been deeply influenced by Kursk. The massive tank engagements, particularly at Prokhorovka, highlighted the importance of operational synergy over individual technological superiority. German tanks, though technically advanced and heavily armored, were vulnerable when isolated, unsupported, or confronted with well-prepared defenses. Soviet mass T-34 formations, coordinated with artillery and infantry support, demonstrated that tactical deployment, operational planning, and coordination could offset differences in equipment quality. Modern military doctrine, particularly in the development of mechanized and armored corps, emphasizes these principles, prioritizing operational flexibility, combined arms coordination, and effective integration of support units to achieve strategic objectives. Kursk also reinforced the centrality of logistics in modern warfare. The German failure to maintain supply lines and sustain offensive momentum underscored that operational ambition without logistical grounding is inherently risky. Conversely, Soviet planners demonstrated the efficacy of prepositioned depots, repair and maintenance networks, and flexible supply chains in maintaining operational tempo. These lessons have influenced global military thinking, highlighting the necessity of integrating logistics into operational planning. Modern forces recognize that even technologically superior units cannot achieve strategic success without reliable, adaptive logistical support that ensures the continuous flow of fuel, ammunition, and maintenance. The psychological dimension of warfare, vividly illustrated at Kursk, has also informed military doctrine. German forces, despite elite status and advanced equipment, experienced erosion of morale due to continuous attrition, operational setbacks, and the inability to achieve decisive outcomes. Soviet forces, in contrast, demonstrated that sustained operational success reinforces confidence, adaptability, and cohesion. Modern military theory incorporates these lessons, acknowledging that human factors, training, morale, resilience, and leadership are as critical to operational success as technological or numerical advantages. Kursk exemplifies how psychological preparedness and troop confidence influenced the execution of complex, large-scale operations. Intelligence and reconnaissance emerged as decisive elements in the battle and continue to influence contemporary military planning. Soviet forces benefited from accurate intelligence on German operational plans, dispositions, and timing, allowing for the precise deployment of reserves, fortification of defensive belts, and coordination of counteroffensives. German reliance on rapid maneuver and tactical surprise was neutralized by this intelligence advantage, highlighting the evolving role of information in operational art. Today, the principles of surveillance, reconnaissance, signal intelligence, and data analysis in operational planning owe much to lessons learned from engagements such as Kursk, where foreknowledge and preparation shaped outcomes decisively. Kursk's global legacy also lies in its demonstration of strategic foresight and adaptability. The Red Army's ability to transform defense into offensive momentum illustrates the importance of flexible planning and the exploitation of opportunities. Operational success was not measured solely by repelling an attack, but by seizing initiative and shaping the broader strategic environment. For modern military planners, this principle remains central. Defensive operations, when executed with operational depth and coordination, can generate offensive potential and create lasting strategic advantages. Historically, Kursk has influenced both Cold War and contemporary military thought. NATO and Warsaw Pact strategists alike studied the battle as an example of large-scale mechanized engagement, emphasizing operational preparation, depth, and coordination. Lessons regarding the interaction of human factors, logistics, and technology informed doctrines for armored and combined arms operations across continents. Military academies continue to analyze Kursk as a model of operational art, illustrating how large-scale battles require integration of multiple elements to achieve strategic outcomes beyond the tactical battlefield. Finally, Kursk's legacy emphasizes the interconnectedness of tactical, operational, and strategic levels of warfare. The battle demonstrates that victories or failures at the tactical level, if not integrated into broader operational and strategic frameworks, may fail to achieve lasting impact. Conversely, well-coordinated operational execution, informed by intelligence, logistics, and doctrine, can transform local tactical engagements into decisive strategic results. Kursk embodies this principle, illustrating how meticulous planning, combined arms coordination, and adaptability can produce enduring consequences across vast theaters of war. By the conclusion of Part 2, it is evident that Kursk's impact resonates far beyond its immediate historical context. The battle shaped the Eastern Front, influenced global military doctrine, and continues to serve as a cornerstone for understanding operational art in modern warfare. Its lessons in logistics, human factors, armored coordination, intelligence application, and strategic foresight remain relevant, offering enduring guidance for military planners and scholars worldwide. Kursk is not only a defining moment of World War II, but also a timeless reference for the principles of modern mechanized and combined arms operations.